Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a late start to the week because I was away in Paris seeing a gig, but I'm back and raring to go. So we've all seen the harrowing footage of B-17s and 24s limping back to their 8th Airforce base in East Anglia, but where were the wounded crews taken and who were the men and women who treated them? Stuart Buxton joins me to talk about the hospitals that saved lives and treated many, and there are family members of people who he's going to be talking about in the site, well, in the viewing audience today, which is really fantastic. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Stuart. How are you today?
I'm very well, Paul. Thank you.
And you're sort of a long-time lurker and viewer, and we have that shared experience of kind of growing up near all these bases and it just being part of our childhoods, and I. Literally, the first veterans I remember that weren't like the guys that lived in my village and my own relatives were seeing kind of busloads of 8th Air Force guys arriving. And this would have been in the, maybe I can remember back to the 70s, but certainly the 80s. So the 8th Air Force, did shows with Clive Stevens. That connection between the 8th and East Anglia is really, really strong, isn't it? And it must be gratifying to you that there are still these links and that the descendants of air crews still feel an affinity for the places where their granddads and indeed great-granddads and grandmothers were 82 years ago. So it's in your blood, I guess.
Absolutely. I've got American heritage myself from the 1950s. And again, from through all the research that I've done, certainly, I know there is a lot of gratitude with what we do here in the UK. I know it might sound a little bit strange, but perhaps we treasure the relationship a little bit more than perhaps the Americans do. The Americans that did serve here and their relatives do feel that very strong bond, and that's something that definitely comes through to me. So.
Well, I mean, that we can get into this later on, but it's that continuity in that so many of the air crews, because of the short tours and the life expectancy, in a sense, only spent even just sometimes a few weeks in England. Whereas for the people who live the villages, it was years. Maybe the flow of people coming to the pubs and the flow of people walking through the village streets changed a bit. Obviously, the ground crews and certain personnel stayed present. But I think, and also that suddenness, and Clive Stevens talked about that, is that most of these airfields just kind of closed down almost overnight and just disappeared. Whereas some of the people who served, who went on to long careers, and then the U.S. Army Air Force becomes the U.S. Air Force. I think that lost a little bit of its sort of uniqueness. It became a different thing a bit. So anyway, we digress, talking nostalgically about our memories there. I'm going to bring up your slides. Folks, I'll make sure we're there. There are a lot of information, lots of photos, lots of maps, lots of stuff, lots of personal stories. So I'm not going to say don't ask questions, but there's a lot of stuff coming your way. We will deal with the ones that I think are important. Basically, I'm going to hand over to Stuart to take us through this. And over to you, sir.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. Before I go any further, I will just say to people, I'm obviously a big fan of the show. So this presentation is really aimed at the layperson. So I know that we've got a lot of hardcore fans on World War II TV. So some parts of it will be a bit wish-washy for some of people, but I'm hoping that everyone will be able to take something from it. I will say something, though, something that I do get asked, I have been asked in the past quite a lot. They assume because I look at the medical system, people assume that I'm a doctor or some sort of medically trained person. So I'll state from the beginning, I have absolutely no medical training at all. I just take an interest in that side of things. And again, because of the US patient and patient insurance laws, etc., the information that I've got tonight and that I will present to you is all from the testimony of the families, etc., and what is open source. So from that point of view, there is nothing there that can't be already found. And if I do get any information wrong, then please tell me. My details will be at the end. It's a learning process. This is such a steep learning curve, and there's so much information out there. Any new information is very, very useful to me.
Brilliant.
So we start tonight with really the very beginnings of things with the story in Great Britain. So it all starts with the United States Special Observer Mission. And the Special Observer Mission were basically 12 high-ranking US Army and Navy observers sent confidentially to the UK as to assess basically the war effort, what was going on. The United States was neutral at that time, so essentially, if they had entered the war or were found to be actively looking at how Britain was doing in the war, etc., it could have obviously conflicted with their neutrality and got themselves into a whole world of issues. So from that point of view, it was kept very secret and very backroom. They came to London in August 1940, and they reported directly back to Washington. Two of the big protagonists here was General Raymond Lee. He was very, very well liked by the British. He got on very well. He was very trusted, and he had access to some of the very highest echelons within the British government. And again, from his personal papers, he honestly believed that Britain had the ability to fight the war pretty much by itself, and it didn't necessarily need the Americans' help in fighting the war and effectively surviving in the face of the Germans. The other one is Major General James Cheney. Now, this gentleman had a very good career. He was made Theatre Commander of Europe in January 1942, and Eisenhower replaced him in this role. Again, he was very highly thought of in the UK, very much a diplomat, both these gentlemen were. And he supported the British war efforts and praised Britain for its preparedness for the war. And his reports to Washington suggested that Britain would be able to fight the Germans, although the war would be a long and hard one because they lacked sufficient industrial capacity to overcome the Germans in an early defeat. So he knew it'd be a long drawn-out war. So from that point of view, again, these two gentlemen played a big part in forming the early views on how Britain was doing in the early part of the war. And another one of the special observers is this fine gentleman here, Major General Paul Hawley. So he was a career medic within the army, and he rose to prominence during World War I, where he was serving in an infantry regiment as an infantry regiment surgeon. He assumed command of the 84th Division's field hospital and reorganised them, and was later credited for saving many men's lives as the conditions improved and the mortality rates declined. He was very quite forward-thinking in that respect at that time. After the war, he gained an enviable reputation for organisation, and within several field posts across the US, he advised upon the Advisory Committee for the Malaria Control. And again, he went on to serve in the Nicaragua Canal Survey. July 1931, he was assigned as an executive officer to the Army Medical Centre, and then he graduated the Command and General Staff School in 1936. So his career was always in a forward motion. He never stood still. He then became director of the Department of Administration for the Medical Field Service School, based at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. And he did this whilst simultaneously holding the position of commanding officer of the 1st Medical Regiment. So that's quite a heavy workloads to deal with for anyone there. He was posted to London in September 41, along with the other special observers, and he would actually see the whole of the Second World War in Great Britain. He never actually returned home once. So that's a long shift to be away from home. And again, he was here firsthand to witness the destruction from the Blitz, and to see how the British dealt with things medically as well. And then after the US entered the war, he basically would become the commanding general surgeon of the Service of Supply, and then become the chief surgeon of the US Army in the European theatre. It's difficult to say whether he was liked as much as some of the other guys. He was definitely a very effective administrator, and he was very good at doing what he was doing. He was good at organisation, and he really made the medical department in the UK what it was. And an interesting piece of trivia for you. So General Hawley would set up his US Army Services Supply and Theatre Medical Department in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire. And in 1952, the former US Army building was chosen to relocate to the government's Code and Cipher School, which was obviously renamed GCHQ in 1946. And the building was used mainly because it was suitable office space and it had a very, very good telephone network, exactly what they needed. And obviously in 2004, they moved across the road to the Donut Building. So it's a little piece of trivia there for you.
Mm.
So in 1942, the Americans come over to Britain. Here's a nice picture of them landing in Belfast in very early days of January. So when part of the Special Observers mission was to basically look at ways in which the Americans could establish their air forces here in the UK when they finally did enter the war. A little caveat to this is when you actually read up about the Special Observers, it wasn't necessarily about a time of if they were going to come over. It was pretty much when they were. The rhetoric behind the scenes was very much of we really want to get over there and have a go, but the public opinion wasn't with the government at the time. The American public still really wanted to stay out of the war for as long as possible, so it was a case of treading carefully at that time. And again, when they came over, they looked at suitable aerodromes. They looked at all of the facilities that it would need. And again, Burton Wood up near Liverpool and again Langford Lodge in Belfast were two sites that they actually went and had a good look at, because they knew that the whole system of coming over was going to be supply as well as basically the fighting elements. So there was a whole lot of backroom work going on in those early days, and a lot of negotiation with the British as well. It was a case of what have you got available, how can we fit in around that. And in the very early days, as you can notice in the big yellow circle there, the 1st Air Division airfields were the first ones to be properly established, and again handed over. Some of these were completed for the British but handed over to the Americans. So again, it was all part of the forward planning of things. And again, when you look at the history side of things as well, Iceland played a very important part of that with the British invasion of Iceland and then the Americans relieving the British. It was all part of being able to get over and secure that North Atlantic route to supply. But hang on, chum, we're still building your aerodromes, because construction of military hospitals for the arriving medical forces were very slow to complete. The Civil Defence Act in 1939 gave the British Minister of Health power to acquire land and erect buildings for the provision of treatment of casualties. So a little caveat to this is the British were actually very well prepared for war. When it came to sort of the phony war period, that a lot of things were going on behind the scenes, and we were really gearing up for mass casualties. You have to bear in mind as well that the British had a special envoy in Spain during just before the war, and they'd seen what the Germans were doing with the Spanish and the bombing, etc. And they naturally assumed that the same thing was pretty much going to happen in the Blitz as well. And they drew upon this experience and started to enact things which would provision them better in the future. And again, the Civil Defence Act was part of that. The Emergency Hospital Scheme was revised as part of that in 1941, and it formed the basis for the design and construction of temporary hutted hospitals. Now, this is an interesting caveat because, again, we would see later on in the war, effectively, hutted hospitals become a thing in a big way, because when the Americans came over, we had to build quickly and to a standard that they could be usable. So again, the hospitals, even though that piece of legislation wasn't actually enacted, it was sort of used throughout loosely in lots of other things. So the speed and the rate at which hospitals would need to be completed were restricted by the chronic skilled labour shortages and the unsecure supply of building materials, especially from abroad kind of thing. So again, we very much turned to our own domestic supply of things. And again, I've actually looked into this. Again, I work within the building sector. So from that point of view, the supply of building materials was pretty much domestic when it came to things like bricks, cement and timber. But again, we still relied on foreign imports for some of that as well.
So just a question for you, Stuart. You mentioned the generals, things like that earlier on. Clearly, right from the beginning, the very first Americans who were arriving in the UK had a real understanding that at the point the war would come for the USA, the involvement of strategic bombing particularly was going to be enormous. I mean, this is coming out of the 30s, and the bomber will always get through mentality. So that they're always thinking on a very, very large scale. I mean, if you're an average Brit in a village and you see the first truck come down the road, you'd have had no idea how big it would have got a year or two later. But the people who are coming over in official capacity, from your point of view, they are completely aware of how big this is going to get.
Yes, completely. Today we look back at what I would call a very 1945 centric view of the Eighth Airforce, etc. You've got to remember their whole existence was an evolution, as in a building up of. It never stood still. And the one thing from the medical side of things is that it was an evolution more than a revolution when it came to it, and a collaboration as well. You have to remember that the Americans were very expeditionary. And when they came to Britain, if they didn't pack it, they didn't have it. And there was a lot of collaboration going on, especially in the medical department, as well as everywhere else, like communications, everything else, intelligence as well. So again, it's like I say, we do look at it as a very formalized, finished picture of what we see in 1945. But in the early days, it was very small, and they did have some sort of idea of where it was going. So you were absolutely right with that. Yes.
Cheers. Thank you. Back to you, sir. We're loving it.
So upon arriving in Britain, the 306th Bomb Group flight surgeon Thurman Schuller took control of his station sick quarters, and that was built to Air Ministry specification over at Thurley. So on the 9th of September in 1943, he wrote in his war diary, and I have my copy there, complete with lots of notes. I was surprised at the hospital setup. It is quite a large building, well built. It has 3 wards with 18 beds, fully equipped except tonsil instruments for surgery, and last but not least, an elaborate bomb-proof gas decontamination setup. It's better than anyone has any right to expect. So this is real good prime source material that we have today. And again, we don't have a lot to go on the medical side of things. As backroom boys, it's not glamorous, it's not sexy or anything. It doesn't get really recorded too much about. So books like this are absolutely gold dust when it comes to getting a view into the mindset and the way things are going. So in the early days, he's come over and he's come to a station that's been built, and he's quite impressed by it. So it shows that perhaps, things could be quite good. Unfortunately, the honeymoon period did not last too long. So on the 14th of September, just a few days later, he writes, "Sanitation is certainly a headache. McKim has been placed in charge of that, and he's trying hard, but not getting nowhere much. There's only an open bucket latrines, and the emptying of the buckets is a source of much trouble." So already he's identifying issues with the building, the way the system works, etc. And again, another caveat to this is you've got to understand the Americans work and think much differently to the British. and that will become quite apparent later on. So, and it becomes quite frustrating in some circumstances as well. So the 306 reliance upon the British medical support was apparent from very early on. So just 7 days on the 15th of September into his service, he wrote, "One of the pilots broke his leg in a Jeep accident last night, and I took him to Oxford today. That's about 65 miles from Thurley. It was fun getting there. The English have done a marvellous job of removing all the road signs, so it was quite a task manoeuvring all over the crooked and crossed roads without losing one's way, but we had some good maps." So again, he's showing the logistical issues that he's facing with casualties, because you've got to remember, when they came over in the early days, there was very few actual general hospitals set up where you could stay for any length of period. These were more sort of like emergency station sick quarters, what the RAF was using. And again, the Americans actually did copy pretty much the blueprint for that. So from that respect, what you're seeing is the logistical issues that they were facing when they got anything more serious than real basic injuries and other things going on. So on the 22nd of October, he wrote, "We've just returned from Oxford. We took Sergeant Mullivill, the chest injury case, to the General Hospital in a B-17. Lieutenant Tunnell, as a pilot, a Fortress is not the best ambulance plane in the world, but it was quick and more comfortable than a car. This is the second case within 10 days that we've had to evacuate by air." So evacuate by air. Why are they evacuating people by air? Because they're finding it quicker, because again, they're not used to the road system. They're not used to the logistical sense of things. And it's quicker to be able to drop an aircraft in somewhere and then transfer from there. And again, I would probably say that's more of an American mindset than a British one, because here we would use the road transport system because the distances between destinations for us would probably be a lot smaller than what they would be in the States. So for them, it would make sense for them to go straight onto an aeroplane and get them to where they were going. But again, in December 1943, he then criticises the emergency medical service hospitals. And he basically comments British hospitals aren't the best. So what is he saying there? Well, could be lots of reasons. The main ones are probably that the emergency service hospitals are now basically experiencing staff shortages. They are seeing medical supplies problems. And again, Britain's been at war for a little while now. So the stresses and strains being put upon those hospitals are taking its toll, really, and anything that's coming into them aren't perhaps getting that first class service that perhaps they should be. And again, he's now picking up on that a little bit. And one thing that Thurman does do is, I think he's actually very perceptive. When you read his whole diary, he does look at things in a very perceptive way. He does look between the lines on things. And again, he's quite a diplomat as well. So in February,
do you think, Stuart, that this, sorry, I mean, obviously you're talking about specifically the medical aspect, but when we're talking about 1943, we're talking about the era when the 8th Air Force Light Bomber Command was not at its peak efficiency, shall we say. You know, they hadn't quite grasped the way of doing things. It's before the long range fighters. It's before some of the improvements to aircraft, improvements to processes like that. So do you think that there's almost like a chicken and egg situation? If things aren't going good in the air, it makes the medical things look worse. The medical, there's sort of a general kind of feeling of negativity at this point. Is that something you see in the study, the medical aspect, that it's all connected?
Sort of. It's difficult to say because there is so little original documentation on this. We have to go by war diaries predominantly, etc. So, like I say, it was always a case of development from the word go. And again, for me, the Americans coming over to start the bombing campaign was a little bit sort of like almost like a false start, shall we say.
Right.
It was a case of like everyone's, let's get over there really quickly and we'll get into it. And then someone went, oh, hang on a minute, we've forgotten something. And this is the thing. It seemed as if there was a certain level of planning that went into things, but it just didn't quite materialize, perhaps. So again, like the first air division kicked everything off. They started their operations, etc. But then, as you say, as you started seeing the casualties coming in, it was a case of, right, we're now seeing and living these experiences, and maybe we're not quite set up perhaps in the way that we should be for them. So it's difficult to explain, but I think there is a little bit of maybe a bit of stop-start in there kind of thing from that aspect.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, sir.
So in February of 44, he then notes in his diary, they're enlarging the hospital here a little. That doesn't make me a bit mad. Some of the plans I am getting modified a little. True to form, the British made everything backwards to what we would have done. It will be completed in about 3 months. So again, this is a lovely statement for me because, again, it talks about the shortages. It's taken 3 months to literally put up some brick buildings kind of thing, which are in a temporary form. Nowadays, we'd look to probably do that in a week, maybe, but it's taken them 3 months. But why is he getting angry? Because the plans are all backwards to how he would do it. They're used to a different system, a different way of working. And again, the British are working to their air ministry standards, which are perhaps tried and tested through links with the RAF and how they were doing things. So it asks questions about what is going on there. So again, we could almost call it the US Army Air Forces learning on the job. So we're going to take a step slightly back now, and we're going to look at the origins of the USAF and learning on the job. So in the aftermath of World War I, the US chose to be politically neutral and have a non-belligerent foreign policy. So the National Defence Act reduced the Army's enlisted strength from 10% down to 5% in that interwar period. The scale of decay led to a land-based army of just 200,000 men. This ranked the US as 18th amongst the world powers, and that's smaller than the army of Romania and Belgium in 1939. And look what happened to those. Mm. The Army's medical department was slashed from a World War I strength of 340,000 men to just 11,500 officers and enlisted men. That's 30 times smaller. And it had to adjust to a static Homeland Defence Force. It wasn't quite as expeditionary as it once was. And again, quality really did suffer. Some of the things coming out in the documents that you'll read, they had a real brain drain of doctors. You found that there would be some doctors that would be very much career military men, but many would go into private practice because they'd make more money that way. So they lost a lot of really, really good men who were capable of looking after their armed forces. So when the US Army entered the war, it was expected to expand to around 100 times its size upon mobilisation day. So let's put that in context. They're going to go from that 11,500 almost back to that 340,000 men again, literally overnight. And it's just not possible. You can't do that. And the problem was mainly that it was solely designed to provide care for a land-based soldier. And this is a reoccurring problem through the whole story of it. You've got to remember at this point, the US had no Air Force. This was just an Army and a Navy-based military doctrine. So the first issue is that the US Army Air Force was part of the US Army. It was not its standalone service, and this made it reliant upon the Army's logistical supply system and the medical system. And the second issue is that the needs of a ground-based soldier were much different to a flying airman, and that's known as aeromedical. So the medical care you'd need to be provided within a theatre was along a dispersed network of airfields within the theatre. Not in, it's maybe like a mobile division or something similar to that. And again, the high quality emergency surgical and definitive care that you would need for the airmen is much different to what you would need in a mobile, fluid, ground-based warfare. And again, you have to add something into it as well. You have to care for all of the thousands of USAAF personnel upon each aerodrome. So when you consider every aerodrome had between 2,000 and 3,000 people on it as well, that is a huge medical system requiring some specialty as well as a huge general capacity as well. And again, it really took its toll in dealing with that because, again, the US Army didn't perhaps quite understand its needs for that. Just as an interesting caveat there, if you look into the right-hand top-hand corner there, there's a gentleman holding a telephone. That gentleman is Dave Vinson, and he was the physician over at Rougham, and he would later on join the 65th, which we'll talk about later. So we'll just have a quick look at understanding the system. So this is a diagram which basically describes the US Army medical system. So at the top of it, you've got your first echelon care, and you move down it. It's all via echelon. So because the USAF was a division of the Land Army, it followed this kind of system in the way it dealt with its battle casualties. So in the Land Army system, your first echelon would be your frontline care, so your aid stations, etc. Your third and fourth echelon care system provided by the US Army Service Supply and the Army Service Forces, as it would later be, were arranged your fourth echelon between the third and fourth. And then your fifth echelon care was effectively repatriation back to the zone of the interior or back to the US. And again, the Army based this upon its needs for its ground-based soldier, and really the Army Air Forces had to fit in with it the best they could. So let's look at a war within a war. So the US Army Air Forces were never happy about being part of the Land Army. I will definitely tell you that. There was a lot of animosity between the two of them. And shall we say, there was a lot of very heated meetings going on between the two throughout the course of their history. And they really did, the USAF really did consider their needs to be different than the land-based soldier. And to a point, they are absolutely correct. And the Air Forces really did believe that they should have had their own medical department and medical system. And they really did advocate for that very early on. And again, David Grant, pictured there, was a big advocate of that. And unfortunately, every time that they brought issues up with the high command, investigations were always looked into it. And again, unfortunately, the Army would always find counter arguments and basically say, look, the care is really good. We're doing everything that you're asking of us to do. It's just perhaps you're not being quite realistic about your expectations. And again, this then caused further animosity. And again, it all came to a head because basically quite a few airmen became lost. Yes, lost. In British parlance, we all know the film, one of our aeroplanes missing. This was very much, oh dear, some of our airmen are missing. And it was very, very embarrassing for the service of supply. So the problem which developed was basically when casualty airmen were moved from the Air Force Station Sick Quarters or base hospitals to the upper echelon Army Services Supply Care. So that would be your station hospitals, the evacuation hospitals and the general hospitals. Once they'd recovered and been treated, they effectively became soldiers within the Army again and returned to the Army for disposal. So you had the system of essentially really highly trained airmen going into the medical system, recovering, and then being posted to infantry positions, etc., in other places, and basically they're being lost. So you're losing really good quality airmen that have been trained to do a specific job, and they're not coming back. So the answer, after a lot of heated arguments, was basically a detachment of patients would be created. So effectively, when an airman came off station, he would then be seconded to the detachment of patients. And when he needed to be disposed of back to unit, they knew exactly where he came from and could get him back to that unit. It would take a few months to properly iron things out. But again, this was the most effective way of dealing with this within the army system. So whilst it wasn't perfect, and they still had teething troubles with it, it did work out. And again, through records, you always see a lot of this detachment of patients being mentioned. And again, there is very little actually written about how this came about. I've had to go on quite a long dig deep for that. But again, it's quite an interesting thing, the fact that they lose airmen in a system. And again, when you're considering that they're still trying to build and improve on, and again, they haven't really got the capacity to lose good quality airmen, and every airman was vital.
And I'll be honest, Stuart, if we stop the show right now, just that little bit of information alone has made this show worth doing. You know, that the idea of them, because we kind of, in the movies and things like that, when, you know, you have that idea of like the soldier in the front line, or even in like an Air Force movie, some doctor coming to say, well, it's a few weeks off your feet for you, chap, kind of thing. You have a feeling that they're part of a unit of people they know, but the idea that wounded men are just getting kind of lost into a pool of service numbers is extraordinary. So that alone is worth your appearance here. So
you know, again, if you put yourself in the positions of an Air Force commander there, let's say you're on station, you're a commander of a group, you've got three squadrons there, and suddenly you're noticing that you might be potentially 20 or 30 airmen down, you know, and they're not coming back to you, and you're like, well, where are they going, kind of thing. They can't just disappear into the ether. Where are they going? And this is the thing, this was the real problem that they faced. And again, it's a point to note, and a point of trivia there that I've put on screen. The US Air Force would not actually establish its own dedicated medical service until 1949, so well until after the war. And that's when it legally severed its ties from the army and could form its own medical department. So doesn't that just show you the cumbersomeness of the whole system, and the fact that it was a very, very slow evolution. And it was definitely a war within a war. It rumbled on well until after the war as well. And again, like you say, it's an interesting point, because again, they needed really good men there and they lost them. So let's just take a quick look at care for the flyer. So the USA Air Force believed that its airmen were really special. Let's have a quick look at why they were special. So to put it into context of the US Army echelon system, so the first echelon care for the USAF would be the aeronautical first aid kit. So when you were not flying, all air crews were obliged to attain first aid classes. Their skill in using it would be the difference between life and death on a painful 4-hour ride home for more substantial medical care. So again, let's just take a second and put this into context. Let's suppose you've got a really bad wound and you're up into the air where it's bitterly cold. You're a long, long way from home, and you've got 2 or 3 hours to sit there. You could potentially bleeding out. You're in a lot of pain. All you've got is what's in that little first aid kit to keep you alive. And your mates around you, they're skilled in using it in freezing cold conditions where they're probably going to have to wear gloves, etc., oxygen masks. You're not going to get comfortable. You could be under fire from the enemy as well. That's a really tough situation to be in. And again, it was the same for whether you were RAF or USAF. Unfortunately, it was, it's not good enough. But what can you do when you're in that situation? It was something that might be able to get you home. So let's briefly look at the ways that a young airman, and a lot of them were very, very young, 1,000 miles from home, could be physically, emotionally injured and understand what their medical needs would be. So first of all, the effects of flying at altitude. And I've got to say, I think that is one of the best photographs that was ever taken. So oxygen is required to breathe at altitude, anything really over 10,000 feet. Failure to consume oxygen results in a condition called anoxia. So airmen that suffer from anoxia or lack of oxygen, basically they act drunk and then collapse. So you'll start talking gibberish, you'll start doing really weird things, and then suddenly your brain just loses all that oxygen and you just collapse. So the question is for you, Paul, and everyone at home watching, how long can an airman survive at 35,000 feet without oxygen? And the answer is 25 seconds of useful consciousness, 45 seconds of until unconscious, and then 15 minutes till death. So again, this is a report from the 20th Air Force in 1944. And basically they looked at cabin pressure failure and just tried to work out how long their procedures would be before their airmen could survive in it. So again, let's just put this in, just step back and put this into a context. If you're telling me that if your oxygen supply failed, you had 25 seconds to solve the issue, unblock it, get a new system or something before you then start with feeling them obnoxious symptoms, where you might then start doing really weird things that you couldn't explain, you didn't understand what you were doing. And then you think about it, 45 seconds, you were then pretty much unconscious. And again, if you stayed without oxygen, you were dead in 15 minutes. So again, that's not something that the Army Medical Department would understand as a ground-based soldier, and they weren't quite with that. So again, the Army Air Forces were correct. They did have a special case for the aeromedical side of things. And again, the bit of cold to the aircrew at that height is absolutely extreme. So again, they came up with the layered system. The British had something similar in the RAF. But again, most people that knows anything about the USAAF knows about the layered system and the bluey heated suits, etc. And they worked. It was a solution to keep men warm, but it wasn't the end of the story. It didn't, shall we say, prevent the injuries and the deaths that it should have done. So it was always a system that was under review and definitely open to improvement. And part of the cold was wind blast as well, or wind chill, if you'd like. The effects of cold, if you were sitting in an aircraft and you weren't in the direct wind, you might have different effects to the cold. Whilst you might feel cold, you weren't in that real bitter chill. But when you're in that wind blast of an open gunner's position, it could even drop even lower. So again, what a cracking poster from the time to tell you, make sure you wear your gloves. You don't touch your guns with bare hands. We've all seen it on Masters of the Air kind of thing. Don't lose your fingers. And again, this was one of the biggest issues that the USAAF had. Ill discipline, as we'll see a little bit later, was very, very difficult to drum out of the men. And an interesting caveat to that, the Cheyenne upgrade, big part to that was down to the aeromedical side of things. They wanted to reduce that wind blast into the actual aircraft itself. And again, the enclosed waist gunners positions were part of that. So in the book, Flight Surgeon, Complete and Unbridled Combat Medical Diary, it's described one of these frostbite cases. So 21 aircraft from this group took off today with their target as Bremen in Germany. Altitude was flown at 25,000 feet and their temperature was recorded at -40. There was no aircraft loss. However, there were 17 cases of frostbite, 2 cases of burns and 3 cases of anoxia. One plane landed near Waterbury and was evacuated Sergeant Homer to the RAF hospital at Waterbury. He suffered frostbite to the face and he's described as being severe. So again, let's just look at that. So we're here in November 1943. We're still relying on the British hospitals around us, but also it shows you the gravity of the situation. They're now really understanding high altitude combat, where frostbite is claiming 17 cases out of the group. You're getting 2 cases of burns as well, which again, he's not documenting what they are. We can speculate to what they be, but they could be electrically heated suits burns, anything else. But again, we're getting 3 cases of anoxia. So again, it shows the real trouble that in those extreme altitudes you get with the equipment and what is going on up there. So the way that I like to look at things is, if Mother Nature doesn't kill you, then the enemy certainly is trying. And that's something that I think should always stick at the back of your head when you're talking about, well, any kind of aerial combat from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, and we think about things like jungles and deserts as being killer environments. We've talked about that on the channel, and malaria and things like that, and dysentery infection. But I think subconsciously we don't think of like France and Germany as being the same. But we're talking about the altitude. We're talking when it's not, it's the environment up there in the sky is very different to the environment down there on the ground. So I think we probably all, I mean, we've all, as you said, we've all seen Masters of the Air and Memphis Belle and things like that. So we watching this today are aware of the unique problems faced by the war at this altitude. But I don't know that generally it's something we think of. We think of the jungle as being an environment that kills you, but not, not urban Germany. But it's all about the altitude.
Absolutely. So, and again, when you think about these cases of frostbite, I did read some diaries where one of the combat crews who was quite experienced, he decided to stick his head out of the waist window of a B-17 just so he could have a look at the bombs going down, and made a horrific error because his eyelids froze. And he was in, and it's just one of those stupid things, momentary ill discipline of thinking, hang on, if I do that, there is a consequence that I could get hurt from it. And it does, we don't look at it quite like that perhaps today. And again, you got to remember, a lot of these guys are very young. When you're young, you're very brave. You're not quite disciplined in what you should do. You don't see danger quite like you do as if you're older. So from that aspect as well, when you're young, you are brave. You're brave and stupid. You do daft things, don't you? So again, when it comes to those things, is there a little bit of that mixed in with the flavour of it?
And literally, the as you said, the taking human beings into environments where they can't live. I mean, that's what you're cheating nature by having, oxygen and heated suits, and now we're used to pressurized cabins, things like that. But again, going to deserts and jungles, humans have been living in deserts and jungles for millennia, but humans have never lived at 25,000 feet. It's like submarine warfare. You're going into an environment with human beings that forget about the enemy. It's just you're cheating death. You're cheating nature. So it's extraordinary stuff. You
need to basically command the environment before you take on the enemy, effectively.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Thank you.
Schuller, in his book, describes what I think is potentially one of the worst cases of frostbite that I've come across in any of my reading. So on December the 9th, 1944, he says, I went down to the hospital last night. While there, I saw the worst case of frostbite that has ever occurred probably in the history of aviation. He was in an RAF hospital for several days and they had never seen anything like it. Now, that's quite a statement because, again, the RAF saw a lot of frostbite and other bits and bobs as well. It was the case of a navigator from Molesworth. The nose of his ship was blown off and the bombardier was killed. He was knocked unconscious and rode for a long time at temperature around -45. His entire face was frozen, also his hands. He will lose his fingers up to the knuckles. His entire face is gangrenous and will lose much of his forehead, probably his eyelids and nose, and much of his cheeks. His neck was swollen so bad a tracheotomy had to be done. It's too bad he wasn't killed. So again, we just got to stop and just take stock of that. He's going to lose just about all of his fingers. His entire face was frozen, so much of his face will have had to been cut away because the skin will have died and the flesh will be dead. He's going to lose his forehead, probably his eyelids, his nose, much of his cheeks, and he's going to struggle to breathe as well. And when you look at that, we now need to stop and think about, okay, even if we can patch him up and he can live, what is the future going to hold for him like that? You know, we certainly here in Britain, we're very aware of the burns cases from the Battle of Britain, etc. But again, the implications of these guys going home, stigmatizing them, the whole issues around living and everything such as that back at home. So it's real life-changing events here in service of their country. So again, it really does make you stop and think about what was going on there at that altitude in just the cold wind alone. So we'll move on and just take a look at the enemy because they're up there as well. So the black puffs in the picture are flak shells exploding. We all know that. And again, flak shells have to be fired 30 seconds before they actually reach the target. So as you got the aircraft coming across, that shell has to land within the vicinity. And most of the shells have a blast radius of between 4 and 14 meters, depending upon the size of the actual artillery firing at you. So again, this can be very destructive, even though sometimes the accuracy of the flak isn't brilliant. And again, there's a lot of caveats around flak in itself, but it actually caused the most casualties out of all of the German air defences during the war. It was by far the most lethal, certainly to the USAAF and definitely to the RAF as well. So it was definitely the principal air defence weapon that Germany possessed. So when a flak shell bursts, it explodes into thousands of small pieces of metal, and the explosion had the power to punch holes in aircraft, and the shrapnel could severely injure the aircrew inside. This is a real-life photograph from the 493rd over at Debich. The flak shell that made that hole injured the radio operator, and he actually attended the 65th at Redgrave, and I'm in contact with his family as well. His story hasn't made the presentation, but again, that picture, I think, gives you 1,000 words. If you get hit with that flak shell, it can do serious damage, big enough for 4 men to stand in it. So, Paul, another question for you and everyone at home. So, did the screenwriters of the 1990 movie Memphis Belle write the exploding tomato soup in cockpit scene into the movie because of the following real-life occurrence? So, on the 29th of April, 1944, B-17 pilot Richard E. Harkin of the 388th Bomb Group based at Netschel in Suffolk was attacking Berlin. So just after as the lead ship dropped their bombs, a flak shell burst in the cockpit. Richard Harkin, seen here on the left of the picture, took a direct hit to his face. His co-pilot, Ernst Hadley, could not use his left leg or his arm due to his injuries, so it exploded between the two men in effect. Charles Neff, who was the bombardier in the nose of the aircraft, managed to clamber into the cockpit, recover Richard Harkin's slumped body over the yoke of the bomber and assists the co-pilot to recontrol the spiraling bomber. Once level, he flapped Richard's torn face over, so he actually flapped the skin over and put an oxygen mask on him, which sealed his injury to the bitter cold. Neff then navigated and assisted Hadley to fly the B-17 back to Nettishall, missing all enemy defences and then performing what is said to be an impossible and world's first autopilot landing of a B-17 bomber. The crew returned home over 8 hours late, assuming missed in action.
Good grief.
Absolutely. Now, their story is told on the 388th Bomb Group YouTube channel. It's a collection of 4 or maybe 5 videos. The sound isn't 100% on it. It's quite difficult thing, but I've listened to them a good few times, and this is an absolutely amazing story. And I'll be honest with you, I'm very, very surprised it hasn't made any kind of movies or anything such that, because there's a few caveats around this. When Charles Neff actually describes when they actually left the bombing run, the aircraft actually turned off course, and he said that is completely normal. They normally bank to one side and go away. He said, but what stuck out in his mind was the fact that it didn't stop banking. It effectively rolled all the way over. And he said, basically, I'm finding myself, I'm holding myself onto the ceiling of the aircraft. Then the radio's erupting and saying, basically, pilot's been hit, etc. And he's managed to climb up into the cockpit and basically pull Richard off the yoke and be able to actually control the aircraft so it stops spinning. They're still losing altitude at an amazing rate. He clearly remembers and states that the cockpit was absolutely covered in blood, and it took them several minutes to wipe everything down so they could actually see the instruments, etc. And then what is bizarre is when they start to try to work out where they were and navigate home, they actually found that they were flying towards Switzerland. And so with the help of the radio operator, they managed to triangulate where they were, and basically using radio signals, they managed to zigzag their way back towards the North Sea. And he clearly states that the saving grace for the crew was that just before they started their operational tour, Charles Neff had actually done a basic navigation course, which was literally like a day or a 2-day course. And he said that they actually flew what would be over Ipswich, over Felixstowe, Harwich, and like the Stour Estuary. And he said when they came back over the North Sea, he said he recognised Ipswich and that area, and he knew that there was a railway line that ran between Ipswich and Norwich. And he said effectively what he did is he got pilot to fly up the railway line, and when he picked out the town of Diss, he basically hung a left and flew back to Nettishall. And again, they decided that between the two of them, they weren't capable of actually landing the aircraft. They didn't have the strength or the ability between them. So they agreed to leave it on co-pilot, which would steady the wings. So essentially, the aircraft would stay steady, and all they would do is throttle back and effectively just crash land the aircraft into the airfield. It was the obvious thing to do at the time. They managed to do that. And on the video, Charles Neff actually says he's a little bit disappointed with himself because he didn't actually manage to pull off the end of the runway. He sat there, and they just controlled it with brakes and etc. And I think for someone in that situation, that's quite an amazing recollection and sort of thing to think, well, I could have done better under that situation.
People are questioning the fuel. How did they have enough fuel to get about in the sidebar?
I don't know. It's all on the YouTube channel, so please watch it. It is absolutely amazing. So I'm just going on what I've seen. But what something else that he mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, is he recalls a few days after the incident, he was back technically operational again, and he got called into the CO's office, and there were some men with suits on, and he was asked to relay the whole events, which he did. And the men in the corner said, "No, you're talking rubbish. You can't do that." And they turned out to be men from Boeing, and basically Boeing London office. And he said, "That's right." And I said, "No, seriously, that is how we did it." And both men said it. And Bowen was so taken of this, he says in the YouTube channel that they actually went back to the States and tried it, and they came back and went, "Yeah, it's actually possible. We've tested the theory, and it does work, but we didn't think it would do." So again, it's an amazing story there of how flak can really do things, and it's quite a nice little story there.
Yeah.
So just to sort of go on a little bit from flak, because it was by far the most lethal for all aircraft in the air. So a 1943 study into battle casualties concluded that 38% of all wounds were caused by low velocity projectiles. So that would be flak. Bullets are considered to be high velocity. In an attempt to stop so many needless injuries to airmen, the 8th Air Force created the Central Medical Establishment in November 1943 by the General Order 205-52 at Pine Tree. Operating under the supervision of Colonel Armstrong and Colonel Grow, the establishment is divided into 5 units, which consists of high altitude training unit, a psychiatric unit, a research and development board, the medical board, and the school unit. And they worked very tirelessly to try and cut out a lot of the really low grade injuries that they were sustaining, which were not keeping men in the air. So again, this is a real effort to sustain your men in the air and keep your combat effectiveness for the war effort. So this unit is best known for their development of the flak jacket. That is by far the one thing that came out of everything that made the biggest difference to things. So the flak jacket was a protective body armor, effectively, as we would know it today. And it was made originally in conjunction with the British manufacturer Wilkinson Sword. We all know them as a razor blade manufacturer nowadays, but again, they were quite a big company that specialized in different things back during the war. So the flak vest consisted of 2-inch or 50mm manganese interlocking steel plates, which were sewn onto a canvas apron. The first 600 were manufactured here in England, but because production was so slow, examples were sent over to the US where it could be copied, production could be sped up. And by early 1943, all crews had been issued with body armor. It was very heavy and cumbersome, and airmen hated wearing it because it is that heavy. I've actually worn body armor, and I can absolutely say modern day body armor is heavy. So that would have been even heavier because it was just real basic technology back then. They developed several types of body armor designed for the different crew stations. For instance, the Type C was a tapered apron, and that was designed for anyone that was basically sitting. So it was for pilots, co-pilots. And then you had the Type D, which is pictured there, which is the full apron. So it protects more of the main body and all your vital organs. The CME was also responsible for the development of crew helmets. So they looked at the way you'd be protecting your head, ears, etc. Improved oxygen systems. Because again, one of the issues they had, and they found with anoxia, is a lot of crews would knock out their lines if they were moving their arms around. They would quite easily knock face masks, etc. So they looked at couplings and lots of other things. That's a whole area in itself. And again, they looked at fuselage design. And again, we saw pictures of that earlier on in the Cheyenne variant. They looked at reducing that wind blast. So there was only so much the CME could do to protect their airmen. In many cases, as I've spoken before, ill discipline was a major factor. So the answer was to rigorously train the aircrews in good practice. So on the 19th March 1943, all groups were ordered to assign unit equipment officers to all squadrons. The equipment officer's mandate was to promote the correct use of protective equipment and oxygen systems to prevent deaths. A 2-week personal equipment officer course was launched on March the 24th in 1943, and it ran until August 1944. 641 officers were trained during this time, and of those officers, 70% were assigned to the 8th Airforce. This is quite a big change in thinking, because we're now moving from is there anything that we can do to any real dumb solutions to protecting our airmen, to now we need to train them and change their mindset. Again, the British did something very similar as well. So once the equipment officers were introduced, and to correct the growing amount of deaths and injuries, Thurman Schuller writes in September 1943, so we are going back to the early days, went to a meeting at Pine Tree today. There was a lot of talk, pros and cons about flying equipment, but I can see that we got a great deal accomplished. I do believe that the equipment officers are working up a little enthusiasm for their job at least. We're going to cut down on our losses from frostbite quite a deal now. So again, from this piece of source material, we can now see that from the flight surgeon's point of view, he can say, look, we really are now starting to get the training perhaps that we need. I can see that we're going to become better disciplined. A lot of these needless injuries are going to hopefully be prevented. So, and again, he's specifically talking about frostbite again, which is something which is just more of a mental thing of, I'm not going to stick my head out of the window, I'm going to keep inside the aircraft, etc. So you can see the way that the thinking is now going. By January the 6th, the following year, they're still fighting that ill discipline in crews. So in the afternoon, the equipment officer and I had a meeting of all the group surgeons and group equipment officers. The primary purpose was to map out some procedure for cutting down the number of deaths we have been having due to oxygen failure. We've had 8 fatalities in the last month, which is entirely too many. The fault lies in improper training, primarily because the fellows are either careless or ignorant in the case of their equipment. So again, just looking at this, they're still having needless fatalities through improper procedure and men not taking the due care and diligence in looking after themselves at altitude, which again it must have been quite disheartening for him, because he's thinking, we're doing everything that we can, it's just that you're not looking after yourself as well. And so the next test we're going to look at is the missiles point of view, or what is classed as missiles in a lot of the medical reports. So the enemy used this wonderful weapon here, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. This is a wonderful photograph of the 109G/6 model. So you'll see a 20mm cannon firing through the prop hub, 2 7.62 machine guns firing through the propeller, and then this one also sports 2 machine guns in gondolas on the underwings. That's a huge amount of firepower coming at you, and again, the thing that we need to take from this is that 20mm cannon. You have to bear in mind that out of all things, the Allies were maybe a little bit slower in adopting heavier caliber weapons. So the British were firing a classic 303, the Americans fired a .50, and the Germans fired one which is even bigger. And the whole idea was that the round would carry more weight, it would do more damage. So here's a lovely radiograph of a German 20mm shell exploding. So you can see that the destructive power, it's known as a explosive mine round in correct parlance. And the idea is it would semi-bury itself within the fuselage and then explode, creating maximum damage. And they were lethal. Again, Schuller notes in his diary in November 1943, the 369th took a terrible beating. They turned around and made a second run on the target. They plastered the target but met unmercifully resistance from the German fighters. Lieutenant Riordan did a superhuman job in bringing back a hopelessly crippled ship and landing it without a bounce in strong crosswind. His tail gunner, Sergeant Dijon, was badly injured in the left arm and leg by a 20mm cannon burst right in the tail. A huge hole was blown in the belly, the left wing was badly torn, the right horizontal stabilizer was torn, and the controls were practically jammed. We flew Dijon down to Oxford about an hour later. We have had 2 lesser casualties, one with frozen cheeks and one with a perforating wound above the left ankle, probably from flak. So again, we've got to stop and look at that. We're now seeing the destructive nature of those 20mm cannon shells. Again, if you're a member of the aircrew and you're being hit with them, they're going to explode. They're going to do a lot of damage to you. And again, all you've got is that aero medical kit and your mate next to you, and he's skilling using it and patching you up, and you've still got several hours ride back to Britain to get that first aid help that you need. So again, that really brings home how scary it must have been up there, and thinking, you know, we're really out there. We're almost a sitting duck in that sky. And again, an interesting thing to take from that again is, again, they're flying their casualties down to Oxford still in November 1943. So he's still talking about those early issues in getting that hospital care established in those early days. So in Flight Surgeon book, he describes the terrible damage a 20mm cannon shell can make. Of those ships returning, several were badly damaged, and Tinkertoy ground looped just off the runway. Tinkertoy had her nose shot out, and the pilot, Lieutenant William Minnerich, had his head blown off by a 20mm cannon shell. There was hardly a square inch of the entire cockpit that was not covered with blood and brain tissue. One half of his face and a portion of his cervical vertebrae were found just in front of the bomb bay. The decapitation was complete. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Thomas D. Sellers, is certainly deserving of any award that may have been given to him for his heroic work in bringing the ship back to base. I'm not going to say anything about that.
No.
Can you imagine being the co-pilot and going, my mate's got no head and I've got to land this?
Good grief, yeah.
And you've sat next to him for 2 or 3 hours and it's just a body. Yeah. How do you go on your next mission after that? Yes, enough said, innit? So let's just look at those other factors. So the aircraft itself is a very dangerous environment too. So remember, you're surrounded by explosive and flammable items. So you've got the actual ammunition, the bombs as well, the oxygen cylinders at that height, they can explode. You've got the electrics. Remember, the B-17 was electrically powered, unlike a lot of the RAF bombers, which were hydraulic. You then got your defective clothing, so your electrically heated suit burns. And again, this comes from source material, and again, we'll talk about this in a little bit later, but I've got a report here from one of the commanders of the 65th, and bizarrely, you can get injured by your turret mechanisms as well. So I don't know what you get caught in that, but people got caught in them. But if the enemy managed to inflict enough damage upon your aircraft and you only just make it out of Europe, you may have to ditch in the sea. The English Channel made for a wet landing and a new set of survival challenges. So I'll just bring to your attention the causes for ditching. Combat damage caused 45% of all ditching cases, more than any kind of mechanical failure, weather or anything else. But don't worry, because the Air Sea Rescue Service has your back. And again, British were absolutely critical in developing the Air Sea Rescue Service. I know there's certainly quite a lot of talk here in East Anglia about it. I'm part of the Melksham Heath Aviation Society. And again, it was an Air Sea Rescue base. So again, really important to reclaim your pilots and their exposure out to sea. But if you were lucky enough to cross the English Channel, and you could get to the coast, you could always use the emergency landing strip at RAF Woodbridge. So the emergency landing strips, we had several up and down the UK, were 2 miles long. They were 500 foot underrun and overshoot. They were 3 runways wide with a fog dispersal system, which means that the most stricken aircraft could land in the worst weather. And large amount of aircraft succumbed to their battle damage upon the landing because they were so badly damaged. When they landed, they weren't ever going to take off again. They'd probably have little or no hydraulics, no brakes, or the flying controls were completely defective. And this meant that after a little while, RAF Woodbridge became a haven for scrapped war wrecks, many being bulldozed literally off the side of the runways and used for salvage. The RAF and the USAAF alike used these. The USAAF took a little while to catch on to the fact that Woodbridge was there. They would land anywhere, though, as pretty much any crew would do, depending upon where you come across the coast. But certainly for Woodbridge, the airfield sprouted a tented cantonment for the USAAF personnel, and they worked very closely with the RAF. The mobile air depot guys would very often try and patch up the bombers so they could then fly back home, etc. And again, Woodbridge had its own dedicated station sick quarters or medical centre, if you like, to attend to the air crews that did crash land. Woodbridge also was quite handy for the enemy to land at as well. I'll let people look into that for themselves. But again, the Germans did gift us something very wonderful at RAF Woodbridge. But again, within the first 3 weeks of Woodbridge opening, it received 62 emergency landings. And then by the 11th of August 1944, it had received its 1,000th RAF and USAAF aircraft. So again, it really was part of the survival plan of getting air crews back to the UK. And again, if you read the book through Flog, Flag and Flame, it actually documents the casualties and where they were taken to. So again, I look at the 65th, so it's on the slide, but other places would have do appear in the book. But if you look over the course of those months, 43 casualties were sent straight to Redgrave. And then you've got Marcham Heath being the nearest station sick quarters to there. And again, 35 servicemen were taken there. So again, let's move on just very quickly. So let's say you've finished your combat mission, you've dropped your bombs, you've come home. You might have a little bit of damage, this, that, and the other, but you've got wounded on board. What do you do? So upon returning home, bombers with wounded aboard would fire red flares when circling the airfield, and then they would have priority and drop out of formation. The 306th Bomb Group were instrumental at creating these procedures to limit the battle casualty losses. They were really the first group to catch on to the fact of if we got good procedure, then we can actually make a big difference to the amount of casualties that we're getting, and we can actually improve the statistics of airmen's survival. Many of these techniques that they had actually created were then shared and adopted across the Eighth Airforce and groups. There were nuances within it, within their own groups and squadrons, etc. Different airfields would mean there would be a different setup as well, according to where they're situated, etc. But generally, they were all within there and there a little bit. Thurman Schuller writes in his diary, so this is back in October 42, the medical crew had a little workout today with some simulated casualties. We got the ambulances out there okay, but we're going to have to work out some sort of system better than we have. So right in the very early days, he's already recognizing that when you've got wounded on board, we need to have a really good system of being able to evacuate them off the aircraft and get them into the medical system so that we can improve their survival chances. So again, that tells a story in itself. They were learning very quickly on the job that what they needed to do to improve everyone's chances of survival. So on the 27th of March, his wish for better equipment was answered. He writes, I was up at Diddington Hospital this afternoon, and I was suddenly introduced to no less than the personal representatives of the Surgeon General in Washington, a colonel and a lieutenant colonel. They inquired about the equipment furnished by them for such stations, and I told them the greatest need in the way of equipment was for a stretcher with which one could remove casualties from a B-17, such as the Neil Robertson stretcher, an RAF item which we were fortunate to fall heir to here, and invited them down for a demonstration. Much to my surprise, they accepted my invitation and immediately came down and seemed to be much impressed with a demonstration of a need of such a piece of equipment. They even remarked, "You have sold us a Bill of Rights," and one might say that's something. When you can sell any idea to anybody in Washington in a few minutes, it is phenomenal. If that litter is adopted as a standard piece of equipment for bombardment outfits, then I have made my contribution to the war effort for this day. And again, I think that really shows the situation they were when they first came over. They weren't quite prepared in perhaps the way that they thought they were to deal with things. And again, it demonstrates how the RAF had a big influence on them in those early days. They really watched what was going on and tried to understand the way that the RAF were dealing with their combat casualties and the way that they could do things better and differently within their system to improve their casualty rates. So senior commanders, crash teams, and the group medical officer and squadron medical officers would normally gather at control towers to watch and wait for the returning bombers. We've seen so many photos of these, and it is pretty standard across the board. A designated medical officer would take the role of an ambulance dispatcher in the tower, and they would be the link between the airfield and the station sick quarters, phoning the casualty numbers through as they landed. So he would be there, and he'd probably be with a notepad, and he'd watch the bombers come in, and as they were then chalking up maybe 2, 3 out of one aircraft, one out of another, etc., he would then be that link back to the station sick quarters and say, guys, you've got X coming in, which is a very similar situation to what we do today in our own ER's casualty departments. So a bomber would fire a second volley of red flares upon final approach to reinforce the injured aboard. And this was another early practice which was adopted, because again, one set, bomber coming in, it just really signaled what was going on in the dynamic nature of the whole group coming into land. Another practice which was adopted, especially if there was injured aboard, the aircrafts that landed were obliged to take the first hard standing off the runway and then would park up with flaps down. So this was a signal of intent that the wounded were on board. So if you had no wounded on board, you would leave your flaps up. And this was adopted after several casualties were actually missed. Again, pilots would come back because they'd been on such a long trip, circumstances up in the air, they just landed. They maybe didn't take that first hard stand. They went back to their usual one, perhaps. And again, people were missed. So again, we're now looking at the system of, we don't want to make any mistakes. We now need to make sure that everyone's in the same mindset of what they're going to do when they get back. In the early days, you would have chase ambulances that would follow the bombers down the runways and attend to them. This classic photograph from Ridgewell shows that. This was then changed sort of middle to the end of the war, where they wouldn't necessarily do that because they would let the bomber park up first and then go to it, because they had this flaps down approach, take the first hard stand. So they always knew that those first bombers coming in were the most critical ones. So they would go to them first. But again, the bombers would always be met by the ambulances, and they would then triage the wounded on board. And the casualties would mount up sometimes. The medical departments would never be sure what they would have returning. and you had to be adaptable. Because of the war in the Atlantic, they couldn't bring over enough ambulances. So basically, under a reverse lend-lease system, the British K2 ambulances were common sight across USAF air bases across Britain. And again, from what I can gather, the Americans actually quite liked them because they were much boxier. There was a little bit more space in them, and you could work on them a little bit better if you needed to for casualties. So what about fighter groups? Well, fighter groups would adopt a similar medical practice to bomber groups, although fighter aircraft did not contain the quantity of airmen that a bomber did. And due to their aerial combat mission, they generally either got shot down or returned with little or no damage. And that's a real generalization, I know, but you should have seen the other guy. So, this is the thing. When you're a single person in an aircraft, and again, you've got to throw into the equation on that as well. You've got to think after Doolittle introduced the release of fighters to go and strafe ground targets, etc. That was a whole new ball game with fighters as well. You were close to the ground. You were flying around obstacles at low level. A lot of guys didn't come back through ill fortune and misadventure and just unluckiness as well. So again, the escorting fighters wouldn't necessarily be quite in that box, but again, it's still something to build into that equation. So what we'll do now is we'll have a quick look at those station sit quarters. So this is a little bit of a rollback on those early slides where we talk about those early days where a lot of hutted hospitals came about. And again, this is a real classic picture from Attle Bridge, and it's of the Nissen hut type A-class airfield station sit quarters. We're all used to seeing these in pictures. And again, this was a quick solution to building airfields and aerodromes and getting those medical systems on the base. So a station sit quarters, or base dispensary, as they've also called in US classification, was the on-site medical facility for all your aerodromes personnel. So theatre policy dictated that it provided a service not exceeding 96 hours. So that's 4 days. So I'm just going to pause there and just say a lot of people assume that you would go to your base hospital and you might be laid up there for several weeks. No, you wouldn't be. They didn't have the facilities to deal with any particularly long-term, complicated wounds, injuries, or conditions. You would then be sent up those echelon systems for that. So the base hospitals were a very low-level, low-grade form of triage, if you like. So again, if you take it into context, a USAF bomb group would have 3 to 4 bombing squadrons. Each squadron would provide its own dedicated flight surgeon. It would have a medical sergeant and up to 8 medical corpsmen. And their primary concern would be of their own squadron. However, they all contributed to the general medical effort on base to everyone. All sit quarters had their own service group with 8 corpsmen as a basic element and a headquarters detachment. And the group would have their own group commanding surgeon. And again, Thurman Schuller started his life or his career as a flight surgeon, and he built his way up to a group surgeon and higher. So again, you can see the structure that's being organised there, and the station sit quarters were a USAF facility. So these are what we're looking at is the only medical service that the United States Army Air Force has actually provided for itself. Everything else was provided by the US Army, the ground supporting services. So this is where the lines are really now quite blurred. So due to the chronic shortage in labour of building materials in war-torn Britain, the airfields had Nissen-type buildings, as we've seen today, But in the older aerodromes, so we're talking the very oldest RAF bases which were turned over to the USAAF, were built with brick station sit quarters and were built to Air Ministry standards. The one pictured is the one at Honington. And again, a caveat to the whole thing on this is many airfields certainly in Suffolk, were constructed by the aviation engineering battalions, which were mainly of black GI labour. And they have their own medical story to tell. And I'm not going to go into that for many, many different reasons. So the wartime American base hospitals design and layout would vary because of the shortages and the site restrictions, and at the time that they were built as well. But a typical station sit quarters would provide for the following: a 14 to 22 bed ward, a crash theatre, which was adopted by the Americans, and that's from lessons learnt from the RAF, an officer's ward, which was generally adopted from by the Americans from the WAF's wards, which were in use on RAF bases. The post-operative recovery rooms, dispensaries, we'd know them as pharmacies today. They'd have a sick call waiting room, consultant room, and dentistry suites. And every station sit quarter had a central power generator, a hot water boiler, kitchen, and a decontamination annex. And a caveat to this is the British after World War I had an absolute petrification of gas attack, and everything on its aerodromes had decontamination annexes, and this was really a leftover from that mindset. A lot of the buildings were never actually used and were repurposed for other things. Most people would use them for storage. Some people used them as extra wards. Medical officers would live on site, and the mortuary was generally part of the ambulance garage, just at the back of the garage on site. And again, what are station sit quarters today? Well, there's so many of them hidden in plain sight. Just here in East Anglia alone, a real good example is Ridgewell Commemorative Airfield Museum. That was a station sit quarters. And again, if you go to the 96th Bomb Group Museum, the museum is actually part of the mortuary, but the part of the Eccles School there is an actual brick station sit quarters as well. And again, the 34th Bomb Group buildings are still there today, and they're used for industrial use. So the station sit quarters would also be a place where your general personnel on base would be able to go for any ailments or sickness that they had. So we'll just take a quick look at that. So the group medicals officers had their work cut out. With so many virile young men on base, the Liberty runs to local towns started to take its toll on the combat effectiveness of the squadrons. So Thurman Schuller wrote in his diary, November the 4th, "I'm becoming greatly alarmed over the venereal rate in our command during the last few days. It is exceedingly high among the combat crews, the rate being at the present time 193 per 1,000 airmen, as compared to the usual rate of 20 to 30. The thing came to a head this afternoon when Lieutenant Warner, one of the very finest and most conscientious pilots in the group, showed up with gonorrhea today. It just makes me sick." So I think this tells a story. I know,
but we're not necessarily going to tell that complete story.
No, absolutely not. But again, it describes that. Again, certainly being British, Paul, we always call it the friendly invasion, and we use the phrase oversexed and over here. And again, this sort of backs that up a little bit. I'm not going to make any generalizations on it, but where there's lots of men, there's generally something going on. 2 days later, Schuller sends his disgust in writing. "The gonorrhea cases are still pouring in, 9 in the last 2 weeks. There was an officer who came in yesterday who is 38 years old, married with children, and has taught school all his life." So again, this really shows that it wasn't just the young men, perhaps, that had more time on their hands. It was something happened across all boards.
Yeah.
And again, in his book, the editor narrates this wonderful little passage, and I think it really sort of describes the struggle that the flight surgeons had on base in controlling VD rates. The group surgeons, he said, arranged very early to get down into the town of Bedford by having an ambulance go into town every night at 6 o'clock, and the medics would park down by the theatre, down by the river, and we set up prophylactic stations. The town officials did not like having the ambulance there, visible to everyone in the community, revealing the significant problem of prostitution. It was a problem that the town wanted to keep in the background and pretend it didn't exist. And then literally on the 11th of December, he writes, speaking of venereal rate, reminds me of a lad we started treatment for syphilis a little while ago. He picked up a girl in Piccadilly Circus, London. He paid $16 to spend the night with her and was rolled for another $40 and got syphilis to boot. I'm happy to note that the rate has fallen markedly since our determined effort a month ago to bring them face to face with the facts of the situation. So again,
I remember meeting veterans of various, forces, ground forces, air force, who saw some of the videos or the films that got released sort of halfway through the war, and they're not for the faint-hearted, are they? They're
definitely not.
They're going to put you off any sort of contact with any human being forever, I think, and they're black and white. And folks, if you delve into the world of YouTube to look for them, be warned, men
Absolutely.
particularly.
Absolutely. And I think what this just those two little excerpts tell a story about the fact that they were trying to educate as well. It was to promote a thing and get the guys to think about what was going on as well. I know there is lots of documented evidence out there about what certain towns did to try and control prostitution, etc. And I know that certainly in London they used a contract tracing system, and it worked quite well to a point. And again, it really sort of describes the fact that very few people can make a very big difference in an area to your combat effectiveness. And again, these guys really did have a real tough time. And again, for everyone looking at home, and especially the men, this slide is absolutely cracking. It always makes me chuckle when you read it, because it just makes me squirm. Read it.
Yeah. And my takeaway from a lot of your presentation, Stuart, is a lot more effort probably put into preventative work than I would have imagined. I think I would have thought that World War II was more about, okay, here's the casualty, now let's treat the casualty. But the flak vests, all that kind of stuff there, a lot of effort gone into the emergency strips, the way they have systems for the aircraft with wounded to land, that ability to try and prevent more serious cases by eliminating some of the issues before, as soon as you can. So good, interesting stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So just a quick look at the sort of the combat cruise health. So the Americans had maybe not estimated the climatic conditions at ground level as well as at altitude. The British climate is very maritime. It's very wet and damp. And again, this played havoc with the combat cruise health. So aircrew became very susceptible to aerotitis media, which is an acute inflammation of the middle ear caused by the difference in air pressure between the airplane cabin and the middle ear space. So again, just to pause just very briefly and think about it. If you're flying really regular operations, so every 2 or 3 days, maybe every other day, your ears and the pressure inside your head is going to be going from ground level to altitude for quite a few hours, come down again the following day. You're constantly putting your body through these strains that it's not used to. And again, in a damp weather, we all know as British people, we're used to seasonal colds. etc. It's just part of the course. We live with it. The Americans didn't get that. If you were from certain places, the drier central states, you wouldn't necessarily be used to that, and you would suddenly find that you were coming down with real heavy colds, etc. And again, this was another issue which plagued combat effectiveness, which the flight surgeons had to deal with. Schuller notes as well, we have now been given sulfadzine on a compulsory basis, 0.5 gram per day as prophylaxis for colds for about 3 weeks. Naturally, with anything new, there are bound to be all sorts of objections and complaints attributed to the drug. At one station, they weren't using it enthusiastically because it was found it was made the flyers sleepy during their afternoon classes. The adjacent base wasn't using it because it kept the men awake at night. It has been responsible for poor landings, loss of weight, and marked obesity, as well as being accused of being responsible for conditions of much greater concern to a virile young man. So again, sulfadzine was the original antibiotic drug of the time. It was quite widely used. And again, chances are it was probably overused as well. But doesn't that show you how the mindset of the crews, and again, the general personnel, was we're not taking something for our own preventative measures. You could almost say it was quite ignorant not to do so. But again, it's all down to education and the way that you put it over to people. As we know today, back then it was still quite new concepts on that. But back in America, the media circus put a positive light on the air war in Europe, and were not backward in using famous faces to disguise the reality of fatigue and jitters of aircrew who were pushed to the limit. He describes the mental state of aircrew. This is Thurman Schuller. So on May the 2nd, 1943, he documents, we're getting into a pretty bad state of affairs. There are now several real cases of jitters. Captain Chester H. May, usually a very composed individual, was seen crying like a baby in his barracks tonight just because he was tired and fed up. Just a day later, he reported, another case presented itself today. Captain Wright, operations officer of the 94th Group. He was white as a sheet, trembling and very jittery. His first words were that he was afraid. He had been scheduled to go on the operational mission today, later cancelled, as an observer. He began to make excuses and so much as said that he would not go. He frankly admitted to me that there was nothing wrong with him physically, simply that he was afraid. Of all the cases of excessive fear that we've had, all have said they'd continue to go if ordered, but they knew that they could no longer do their job. So again, just to briefly stop and pause, we're now seeing still 1943, very early on in the campaign, men saying we've not got perhaps that mental capacity to deal with what's going on here. And the fear of that theatre is really starting to take hold. And again, you're now seeing a case of people being overcome with their emotions, but saying, look, we know there's a duty to do, but we are really quite petrified about doing this job, you know. So again, I think that's an interesting caveat to the story that we saw them so early in the campaign. So the flight surgeon's role was not just task dedicated to surgery on the theatre table. It could be just to listen. So Schuller again notes in his diary, my medical practice has developed entirely along new lines today. You might say I'm specialising in psychological and psychiatric problems. Not one single patient did I see all day, but I've listened to just about every story I can think of. Between the chaplain and me, I think I am definitely the winner. If this is the job and responsibility of a flight surgeon, then I've got plenty of practice today. This is the sort of thing that tests one's judgment and tact. I always feel so terribly incapable and experienced in analysing and advising and encouraging these fellows. God knows I try very hard. So again, you can see from his writing that he's really acknowledging that he's now seeing real confliction of conscience. Guys have really come over and going, do you know what? I might have got myself into something that I thought was quite adventurous, but now I'm having doubts about it as well. And again, you can see that how his role has changed as well. And again, I think it's nice that he talks about the chaplains as well, because again, we don't very often put the chaplains perhaps in the light that we should do. They played a very important part in talking to people and keeping that combat effectiveness going by just trying to waylay fears and talk things over with guys to get them back into the air. And again, flight surgeons were very protective of their men as well. So there's a whole caveat and a whole different side to what we would assume with them is just sewing guys up, really. Schuller was very, very quite a character. It comes through in his writing as well. He was quite fatherly in nature. And on the 30th of September, he wrote, "Had an anxious consultation tonight. A young second lieutenant came into my room for advice about his wife, who's just had a 10-pound baby girl. But he wasn't home at the time he should have been, according to his calculation of when the conception must have taken place." So, again, I think this is a nice little caveat to it that, you know, we talk about the VD and stuff over here. But again, back home, when you're away, things happen. So from that point of view, again, that can play with a young man's mind when he's over there. He's got the enemy in his face. He's got the environmental conditions. And when he's thinking about my girlfriend, my wife's just had a baby, and I don't think I'm the father. That would really play in your mind as well. So again, very interesting caveat to the story, I think. But by the end of 1943, the 8th was putting pressure upon all groups and men and machines into the air. So again, Schuller notes, "Today I interviewed a couple of fellows from the 91st group who were being charged with lack of moral fibre because too many abortive missions. Both have completed 13 missions. One has aborted 10 times and the other 11 times. One is wearing a DFC. One is particularly a nice chap of 21, married, a real fine pilot. The one who won't take his ship into the battle zone unless it's 100% okay. The other one did 18 missions with the Royal Air Force before joining the Army Air Forces and completing 13. He has turned sour after getting married last June. I haven't so much sympathy with him as I have for the other one, but both of them, in my opinion, should not be disgraced. In the same group, 2 or 3 weeks ago, a pilot had a court-martial charge initiated against him for refusing to go on a mission after having completed 19 missions. We got him off to hospital. That stops him temporarily. That is too many experienced pilots from one group. I'm suspecting that there is more trouble somewhere in the command over there than there is in the pilots. I'm going to make it my business to find out." So again, just to briefly stop and just analyse what he's writing there, he's really now ramming home the fact that you've got some quite battle-hardened guys there, the guys that have been up there, done it, they experienced the situation, they know what's going on, but they're now saying, hey, the strain is a little bit too much for us now. You're asking a lot of us. And again, one of these guys actually flew with the RAF beforehand, so he really did know what he was doing. And again, you see a little bit of fatherly care there, as in, these are my guys, I want to look after them. And he clearly says, look, this stops the process temporarily if we get him off to hospital. So they were very much aware in their mindset that they didn't want to get guys disgraced through lack of moral fibre and other things. And again, an interesting side of this is the RAF had a very clear stance on this, and lack of moral fibre was very much enforced, and it was very in the forefront. The Americans were a bit softer on that. They were much more perhaps cunning in shielding their airmen from these riggers, and perhaps understood combat stress a little bit more than perhaps what the RAF did, or maybe the RAF just really knew that they just didn't have the numbers and they needed everyone. It's difficult to put an absolute fine pin on it, but certainly the Americans did seem to have a softer stance when it comes to lack of moral fibre and their courts martial. So that's another interesting side of things. But again, if the strain was getting to you, you could always go to a USAAF rest home. We all know them as flak houses, or they're commonly known as flak houses. So in 1943, the Air Force recognised that its airmen needed a break from the terror of staring death in the face. The Air Force approached the US Army Services Supply, so they're the guys that run the hospitals, and because they were already overstretched and preoccupied with preparing for the possible invasion of Europe, it refused to entertain the idea of running rest homes for the pilots and the aircrew. So the Eighth Airforce and the Central Medical Establishment pursued the project themselves, and in 1943 they opened their first 2 rest homes. Shortly thereafter, a deal with the American Red Cross was struck, where the American Red Cross girls would supply the labour and for the running of the homes, and they would do all of the recreational facilities and the dinings in the homes, and British civilians would also be employed at the homes to bolster numbers. Some homes catered for just officers, but many were for enlisted men as well, and they were situated across the UK, Scotland to Wales, Blackpool. I know certainly here in East Anglia there was one up in an unofficial one in Munsley. It is documented as being used quite a lot, but it wasn't the size of a rest home like some of the others were. The Scottish one was actually a resort, believe it or not. So the principal idea of the rest homes were for war-weary airmen to stay for a week away from the pressures of military life. Upon arrival, guests were supplied with civilian clothing to wear, and they were free of agenda, unlike the strict military schedule they had been used to, like at 4 a.m. starts. The only formality was that the Air Force remained was that dressing in service dress for dinner, as it was to be kept a formal occasion. Breakfast is listed at 8 a.m. to 9:30, and there was always a good breakfast to consume. Coffee and toast between 9:30 and 10, lunch and then tea at 4:30, and then dinner at 7:30. And there was a snack bar open at 10 o'clock. So again, airmen were actively encouraged to put on weight, and any that failed to would be referred to the on-duty flight surgeon. So again, all groups at one point, their flight surgeons would be seconded to one of the flak homes to monitor the men there for a period of time, generally a week. Sometimes that might be longer. But again, just a little caveat to this as well. You've got to bear in mind, if you're aircrew and you're getting up at 4 a.m., you're having a breakfast, which probably wouldn't be that substantial in today's kind of thing. It would provide you with enough. But again, think about the logistics of eating whilst you're flying at altitude. You're wearing big cumbersome suits, so going to the toilet is going to be difficult. So you don't want to be trying to strip off in -0 conditions to use ablutions. So you would dehydrate yourself by not drinking enough. You would probably not want to eat that much either before you went on a combat mission. And certainly when you got back, you'd be probably so tired, lethargic, fatigued, that you may not want to eat. So a lot of air crews would lose weight over the course of a tour quite easily, and some quite quickly as well. So from that point of view, again, they're really looking at the health and the well-being of these officers. It wasn't just a case of getting them away from that stressful situation, but they actually looked at the physiological side of things as well. And again, at the flak homes, you were getting sports, you were getting pursuits as well, different things, fishing, shooting, bike rides out, lots of different things to get you active and doing something different to what you would normally be doing. And then on the 8th of May 1945, all 17 rest homes and 4 informal rest homes were closed literally overnight. This meant that Oxfordshire Manors, Dorset County Homes Hampshire stately homes, English seaside hotels, and even a Scottish resort had to find a post-war use. These homes made such an impact upon the airmen, many would take to buzz their homes when returning from a mission, a practice which was banned by the 8th Airforce after pilot Zychowski, I think that's how you pronounce his name, lost control of his P-47 above Nightshade Court and crashed. After this incident, a $25 fine was issued to any aircraft found buzzing a rest home, and he's buried at Madingley in Cambridge. But again, I think that puts an interesting take on things, that the airmen really did appreciate just this week away, that rest and recuperation, and the time they had, they treasured that experience. So again, I think it shows you the importance that it put on the actual air crews and keeping their morale high and getting them through that ever extending combat tour that you were always being asked to do more and more of. So now what we'll do is we're coming towards the end of the presentation now. So we're now going to look at those upper echelon care, so the hospital bits. So this is really where my centre of expertise is sort of looking at, or my study, should I say, rather than expertise.
All this bit before, Stuart, you were clearly just winging it. If this is your area of expertise, you did pretty damn good on the first 2 hours. So.
Well, shall I say this is the bit I'm really interested in, if you know what I mean. Okay. That bit is that's just the backstory.
This is the encore. This is pretend you've gone off stage. We'll applaud, and then you come back on again for the final bit. Yeah, okay.
So this is an actual photograph of inside the 65th. One of the Nissen huts on one of the wards. So again, it is incredibly basic. You don't see anything like you would do today in a modern hospital. And again, for me, the thing that from the photographs that I've seen is heating. The 1944-1945 winter was horrific. And a lot of these Nissen huts only had 2 or 3 stoves in them. We all know that those stoves had an output of, well, to be honest, you'd be better off cuddling someone else really for heat. And it just really rams home how basic and how temporary everything really was at that time. So looking at the hospitals, we have to talk about the affiliated hospitals program. So we're now going to take a little bit step back, so pre-war. So as we've seen earlier, the Army Medical Department became incredibly depleted, and upon mobilisation day, as the US joining the war, it would need to expand rapidly. This was a real issue, as it was almost impossible to achieve. Adequately skilled doctors need at least 4 years to train. A good quality nurse requires at least 3 years at that time. So to get around this issue, the Surgeon General of the Army, Major General Charles R. Reynolds, resurrected a scheme previously used in the First World War. The program during the First World War was administered by the American Red Cross, in which civilian universities and medical schools would supply staff to the Army medical units serving abroad. So to briefly stop and look at this, it's a real get out of jail free card, shall we say. So you're going to the medical schools where you've already got a plentiful stock of medically trained doctors, nurses who have graduated but may not necessarily have that experience on the wards, etc. But they've got the skill level required to do the job. Because you don't have time to take vast amount of people in, train them to the standard that you need, and to be able to then disseminate them across all theatres, etc. So in the World War II program, the universities and med schools would solely provide doctors, dentists, nurses, and the Army would then supply the enlisted corpsmen to run and administer the hospitals. So this is a very clear statement of intent. So your doctors and your nurses that required that training would be coming in from the med schools, and then the army would just recruit guys who would do all of the admin, all of the cleaning, cooking, transportation, motor pool, anything such as that. You don't have to do that. We are just going to let you concentrate on the medical side of things. And this was the quick get out of jail card that they needed to get them to mobilize that quickly. And by the end of 1942, 50 organizations had signed up to the program. So just to have a quick look at the program itself, these were all predominantly general hospitals. And again, you're looking at like John Hopkins served in New Zealand, University of Pennsylvania in India, and Jefferson went to Egypt. They served all over the world. Again, if you just look down the right-hand column there, you'll see Guadalcanal in there, North Africa, Australia as well. So they were really about everywhere. And again, the 65th is on there from the Duke University, served in England, as most of them did, because there was something going to go on sort of around 1944 that they would need a lot of hospitals for, because they were expecting a lot of casualties, probably invasion of Europe. So we're going to take a quick look at the setup by the end of 1945 here in East Anglia for the USAAF. So quickly looking at the map, we can see that, so we got the 65th here at Redgrave Park near this. They were really on the cusp of between the 2nd and 3rd divisions. So they would take a lot of guys from there. That's where the bulk of a lot of my documentation is coming from. You're seeing a lot of guys coming in from these places, but especially from the 231st Station Hospital based up in Norfolk at Morley Hall, Wyndham. It's now Wyndham College. And basically, there's a little story behind that. The 231st was originally at Redgrave Park, and then it got moved off when the 65th moved over. Those ties that were made in early 1944 stayed. And you can see that there is a lot of interchangeable expertise going on. The doctors were talking to each other a lot about good practice, etc. as well. You'll notice those 1st Air Division, those original 1st Air Division aerodromes, they were served by what is 2 station hospitals and a general hospital. Now, the station hospitals would very often rotate through. You would see maybe 1 or 2 guys, units, use the same facility, like at Lilford Hall and at Diddington. We've heard Diddington mentioned earlier by Schuller as well. But 163 came to Wemple Hall and they stayed there the whole time. I really looked for a lot of evidence for them, and there is very little out there, very, very little. And certainly if there's anyone out there who knows of anyone that served there, maybe your dad, uncle, your nan, auntie, or anyone, please get in contact with me, because there is that little out there. We just don't know what happened there. So again, that's something that I'd like to look at in the future. Another interesting point is on the picture there, you've got the 805 Hospital Centre at Newmarket. Now, this is another little caveat to the story. So towards the end of the war, when the medical department was really stretched and it was really obvious that you were getting a lot of complex surgical cases coming in and complex injuries that required lots of care long term, a lot of the doctors would be moving around between different hospitals, providing their expertise in their areas. And it was identified early on pretty much that if we pooled these resources, we could do a lot more with perhaps what we've got, or maybe a lot less. And again, this had one eye on the invasion of Europe, when a lot of medical staff would need to move from Britain into Europe and follow the advance through. So the hospital centres were created as part of a group of more hospitals. So you would have a coming together of skills and minds and good practice under those, and they would look at those technical injuries and wounds and things and be able to distribute their skills, etc., better from that. And again, I think that's quite an intelligent use of their resources that they had there. But again, this is the setup which was there. But you can clearly see that you've got quite a few hospitals serving the 8th Air Force in that area at that time. So we'll just take a quick look at the 65th. It came from Duke University from Durham in North Carolina. And here's a picture of just some of the nurses and the other staff. I have quite a few photos, but I'm not going to show them all here tonight. A couple of things to take from these real brief photos. You'll see in the buildings, the tar paper huts in the background. Life on site at a military hospital was not glamorous. You lived in a garden shed, basically. It was cold, it was damp, it wasn't comfortable, and everyone was there to serve. And I'll be honest with you, everything that I have been told by the relatives of serving nurses, doctors, etc., they really enjoyed their service. They enjoyed doing it. It was hard, but they enjoyed their service, and it was something that they felt was really important to do. And again, from the photos here, I think it's really nice. You see the nurses on the left there. They're not in uniform, so there was obviously downtime that they enjoyed themselves. They had to let themselves go as well from the stresses that they saw, because again, it can't be nice seeing a lot of men come in with these really complex wounds, body parts missing, arms in traction, legs in traction, stomach wounds, things like that. And again, it would have taken its toll on that. There would have been a stress behind that as well. So from that point of view, there's another whole story behind that, which really emphasizes the air war as a general meaning. So a quick look at some of the doctors, and this is only brief. This is broad strokes. So on the left, we've got Clarence Gardner. He was chief of the surgical service. Now, he was a Duke University trained guy. He went on to have a long career afterwards as well. But he's got two really important things that I think that I want to mention. One of them is after the war in 1946, he wrote this document here, which was the Air Force Battle Casualties. And it was published in the American Medical Association. And basically what he does is he documents numbers, fact, figures, casualty cases, etc., and a lot of the type of the wounds they were getting. So again, it's common knowledge that there have been certain studies done on combat casualties, etc. But this is first-hand words from a doctor on the front line, seeing these actual wounds come in and seeing the kind of effect of what the enemy and altitude and the combat environment was playing upon those casualties as well. So he's a very important character for giving some flavour to the background of the severity of what they were facing. I'll quickly move on to Dr. William Bridges. So he was the chief of neurosurgery, very talented man. He plays a very important part in one of my casualties a little bit later on, so I won't go into too much detail. But essentially, he travelled to London to learn from London silversmiths how to manipulate metal, and especially tantalum, which is an inert metal which you can use to reconstruct the body. And he did this in extra quick time because of some of the reconstructive work that he carried out at the 65th. And again, when we're talking about 20mm cannon shells taking people's heads off and things like that, imagine what they can do to the human body when they have to break bones and things such as that. So you can sort of get the gist of the way things are. And I'm going to quickly mention as well, Lieutenant Colonel William Seeley as well. He was a master surgeon. Now, he came over to Britain with the 65th, and he served a little while at Redgrave, but due to the shortage of skilled surgeons, he was actually moved to several other hospitals. And again, he was a big his movement to other hospitals was a big part of getting prepared for the invasion of Europe as well, making sure that you had a spread of capable doctors to be able to deal with things there. And he was someone that his skills could be used better somewhere else as well. Someone who I'm going to really cover as well, with a little bit more depth, is this gentleman here, Captain Ivan Brown Jr. So he's special for several reasons, and you will see why. For me, the main reason is his age. He was only 21 when he came to Britain as a qualified doctor. And he was put in charge of the shock ward where the casualties were received, triaged, and prepared for surgery, etc. So during January in 1945, he undertook a marathon 35-hour non-stop shift, operating on the battle of the wounded from the Battle of the Bulge. He only stopped when he collapsed. So let's put that into context. You're always told, don't make yourself a casualty if you do any kind of first aid training. I've done that. Everyone else has done that. He made himself a casualty because his willingness to push himself to the very edge to do it. And again, his sons told me that basically the only things he had was toilet breaks and food breaks, and then he went back to work pretty much. And I know at Same Staff, just knowing this fact about him really sets him up for the rest of what you need to know about him for the rest of his career. He was a remarkable man, and he had a very remarkable mind for engineering as well as surgery. He was a very skillful man as well. He played in the 65th band, and again, very likable as well. He's also responsible for the majority of the documented photographical evidence that we have of the 65th at Redgrave Park. And he was the chair of the 65th Reunion Committee up until 1992. So he was very forward-thinking in documenting his stay. And again, he really liked being here in England. He very much liked the country as well.
And a good point to remind ourselves that broad improvements in medical care benefit the world beyond and after a war. Whereas, you make a slightly better bomb, it may help you assist in defeating the enemy, but it's not going to necessarily, help Mr. and Mrs. Smith in their day-to-day care. But, when you're talking about the plastic surgery and things like that and the Battle of Britain pilots, we can see around us today, 80 years on, the benefits that have come out of the improved stuff in World War II. So people like this, Captain Brown there, have more than one reason for us to admire them. They have the wartime work and then the creativity to improve medical care broadly, and of course the other people you're talking about.
So something that I certainly impress upon people to take away today, and something I do generally, is the 65th were no different to any other American Army hospital. They did the same job, the same role, etc. What I feel was special about them is you had a collective gathering of skilled people at the same time in the same place, which made them extraordinary. And what made them extraordinary was their very, very low mortality rate. What started the whole of my studies off was this list here of 63 deaths. It's just entitled deaths. And all it gives you is the date they were admitted, the name of the casualty, and the date they passed away. And it is the smallest of any American or publicised documented American hospital in the UK. And they are quite famous for it. So when you consider they had over 17,000 patients treated there, to have a mortality rate of only about 63, 66 people die, that's an extraordinary figure. So that's what made them special. And again, I've got a little bit further up, so I won't jump the gun too much. But just to conclude on Dr. Brown, So he was responsible for establishing the hospital's blood bank, which was one of the first amongst the American hospitals in the European theatre. And this was at a time when the Americans were totally dependent upon British blood. So can I just explain that? There's different types of blood. There is whole blood, which is essentially your blood as it flows out of the veins as it is. And then there is other constituent parts of it, or you can break it into 3 constituent parts. And plasma is the basic form which the Americans used. It could be brought over in a form which could be reconstituted, and they used it a lot to stabilize casualties within the bombers themselves. That was the first thing they did. They got you on a drip of plasma to bring down your blood pressure before you could do anything else. Now, the British during the Spanish Civil War knew that you could keep whole blood for 21 days in very hot temperatures. And again, the British Army Blood Transfusion Service had great experience across the globe in all theatres, India, etc. And it was a real expert in dealing with blood and whole blood. The Americans did not have that kind of experience, and they were very reluctant early on to try and fly whole blood across the Atlantic. They said it couldn't be done. They didn't try. And this really put the British in a very strong position because we had control over their blood. The blood story is slightly controversial. It's very interesting itself. We haven't got time for it tonight, and I'm just going to leave it there. But again, it's worth looking at. If someone wants to know any more, I don't like to plug my own Substack, but I do have a good bit on it called Battle Blood on my own Substack, and it goes into it in a little bit more detail. So from that point of view, if you're interested in that, you can have a look at that. In 1958, his wartime experiences would again lead to his pioneering work. He worked with the Harrison Radiator Division of General Motors, and he built an effective blood heat exchanger, which cut the time patients needed to be anaesthetized and cooled during open heart surgery at the time. So these machines are absolutely commonplace, used every day, thousands of times throughout the world today for open heart surgery. He was a pioneer in this division after the war, and again, it led to possibly was from his wartime experiences, seeing people in the theatres. What can I do to improve this situation? So you're absolutely right, Paul, when you say that these medical advances absolutely benefit us today. Again, his wartime blood experience would develop into serving the White House as the US's leading expert on blood affairs during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, his son has told me that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was asked whether it was possible for the whole of the US to be transfused if it went to nuclear war. He pretty much said that's pretty much impossible, and that may have contributed to some of the decisions that were being made at the time. It's difficult to say, but again, if he'd have turned around and said, oh yeah, we can do it willy-nilly, it's an easy thing, the outcome may have been different. That's all I'm going to say on that. But again, it could be that he played his part, a very small part in that, in maybe changing minds, which then made decisions. And then in 1963, after Kennedy's death, he was made a member of the White House official Office of Emergency Management for the next 5 years. His career would be very long as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he was an advisor on the hyperbaric medicine and a thoracic surgeon to the Watson Clinic in Florida. So he had a very long thing, and he really did dedicate himself to medicine. I'm going to leave him there now because he could easily be a whole World War II TV subject in himself. So
clearly,
absolutely. And I'm going to really briefly do this guy because I'm noticing the time. We're really forging on.
Who cares? We're loving it. It doesn't matter.
But this guy here, again, I could come back and talk to you all night on this guy. I'm not going to go into too deep for many reasons, but the main one being is he was born into a prominent Austrian Jewish medical family. He was trained as a neuropsychologist and brain pathologist, and he trained with a lot of the top German surgeons, which would later on become Nazis. So he left Germany to teach in China under a Rockefeller scholarship. And after his father was murdered and his mother died shortly afterwards, he wanted to return to Austria, but was warned against it. So he moved to the United States. Following several jobs in medical schools, he ended up at the Duke University, where he joined the 65th, and he went to war. And Major Dr. Leo Alexander is an absolute legend when it comes to neuropsychiatry, etc. He's very well known. His name is synonymous with a lot of practices today. And he played a prominent part in uncovering and subsequently the prosecution of Nazi doctors' war crimes. There's a whole controversy around that in itself. I'm not going into it, but the one thing I will say is he's, for me, one of the most interesting characters at the 65th, because he was, I believe, at the centre of some real secret squirrel stuff going on, which really set the Allies up after the war for the prosecutions in itself. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If you want to know any more, I'm hoping to bring a book out. So buy the book. Some of the details will be in that.
Fabulous. So
very quickly, tonight, I know I haven't really mentioned this, but I think you alluded to earlier, Paul. I have been told we've got the sons and daughters of the nurses and doctors and patients that were at the 65th. So I'm going to introduce you tonight to Lorraine Stillman. I hope Bill's watching tonight. So Lorraine completed a medical degree at Duke University and immediately signed up for the war effort. She met her husband, Harry Stillman, who would then have a career within the US Navy and then a long career as a neurosurgeon. She is absolutely pivotal for me, because the one thing with the 65th is I had no documented timeline for a lot of what they did pre-coming to Britain. But she's absolutely brilliant because she recorded her wartime service on a little toy bear, and she'd write the dates on them. And Bill kindly photographed the dates, sent them to me, and I now have an absolute timeline of all of their training dates, when they embarked to come to Britain, how long it took, where they disembarked, etc. She's absolutely key to some things. And I had the absolute privilege to meet Bill here in Cambridge in the UK and interview him and his wife. And I learned so much from that experience, and I'm forever grateful for them. And I know Lorraine absolutely loved her time here in Britain. And again, she was very, very fond of her, what she calls her hut buddies. So they're the other nurses that she stayed with in there. So again, a lot of the experiences that are coming through and the fondness for Britain comes through people like her documenting and saying things like that. I'm going to cover very quickly as well Nurse Ray as well. She's an extraordinary lady because, again, at the age of 24 years old, she was serving as a nurse on the orthopedic ward. Now, she's been interviewed previously, and a lot of her interviews are archived at the Duke University, and she really gives a really good insight into the daily life of a nurse. And it is stressful and long. They work some really long shifts, and they really dedicate themselves to the job. They were the backbone of the nursing in the hospital, and real tough ladies for being young as well. So again, she's worth talking about. Emma Schultz, she's not pictured, sadly. I don't have a picture of her. She was only 20 when she came over to the UK, but she clearly documents that they had a time in the late afternoon for the burst of activity, i.e. the casualties coming in from the airfields, and they called it flak time. So that would have been a time around about 3 o'clock in the afternoons. And again, this is clearly comes over in a lot of the documentation with it as well. Sarkis Minaranian was an enlisted medic, and again, he's quite pivotal. He comes up in a lot of the 65th records, all through training, etc. And he has stated, we clearly had some A1 doctors. We used to say, if you were breathing when you came in, you were sure to come out alive. So again, I think that shows that the confidence that they had in themselves, that they could pretty much fix you up and get you back to going where you were going. So, and again, this is just an enlisted guy, you know, from New York. He's that whole ethos and that mindset of we are good at what we do came out and comes through all of the documentation. And again, he would serve upon the 65th Reunion Committee for many, many years. I'm going to very quickly mention Ruby Miller as well, because Ruby was a nurse that worked in the psychiatric wards, and that was one of the most challenging environments. She is clearly documented that she said the ward stayed busy taking care of patients suffering from combat fatigue. It was really tough. We once had a pilot and his entire crew in our ward. They'd just been through many tragic experiences. They were just nervous wrecks. So again, just looking at it, they're seeing firsthand this combat stress, the pressures that are being put upon all of those combat crews out there, etc. Ruby would carry on nursing after the war. She would then go and get her psychiatric nursing degree and have a long career in psychiatric nurse. And no doubt Leo Alexander played a big part in her career on that. And where you have a lot of men and nurses, you generally have relationships. And so I'd like to introduce you tonight to a wonderful story, one that I think is quite extraordinary. And I'd like to, again, introduce Dan, one of our relatives, who's provided me with this story and this wonderful picture. So this picture was taken literally 24 hours before both Dan's mum and dad were shipped out to Europe. On the right is Evelyn, and she was shipped to Britain as a nurse, and John was sent to the Mediterranean. So Evelyn met her fiance, John McDonnell, and they were both engaged, and when they were both joined the army. Extraordinarily, they both ended up training at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, Evelyn with the 65th and Captain Jack with the 88th Infantry Division. They were both due to sail to Europe on the same day and decided to elope and get married in a Boston registry office. The next day, Evelyn sailed to Britain and John into the Mediterranean. Evelyn loved her service in England, and again, that comes through from Dan. Dan absolutely loves, said his mum loved being here in Britain, and again, he was brought up in his early days here in the UK, and he said that the English people treated her like absolute royalty and spoke of fondness of their hospitality. She loved to cycle in her days off and spoke about her trips to London to see shows and the train ride homes in the pitch dark. So obviously the blackouts were a thing for her. She recalls being separated from John for 3 years as being stressful. And again, to put it into context, if you got married to your fiance literally the day before you shipped out and he was serving somewhere, you would have that anxiousness about whether you were going to see him again. So John's got an interesting story. He had a different experience as a company commander fighting in Italy. His unit was at the forefront of action throughout the campaign, and his luck ran out in spring of 45 at the Po Valley, and that comes from Dan. We don't have a huge amount of information about that. So if there's anyone out there who knows and can maybe help me out with that, please get in contact with me. He got shot across the chest by machine gun fire. Fortunately, his wounds would not be life-threatening, but required surgery and an extended period of care. And he was requested that he got transferred to the 65th in England for treatment. And this was done in total secrecy. And basically, I'd like to think of it as he pulled rank and basically said, look, if you can get me to Britain, that's where I'm happy to be. My wife works in one of the hospitals. And can you imagine the shock when one day he walked into the 65th and Evelyn was there? You can only imagine. These guys haven't seen each other for 3 years. Yeah, it's just a moment that makes the hairs on the back of your head to go up. You know, you can't describe those words. You got married to your fiancé, you haven't seen them for 3 years, and then you're reunited at a hospital, and you're thinking, yeah, this is amazing. It's an amazing story, and I thank Dan. Dan's a really good. I class him as quite a friend now. And again, we promise that we will meet up next time he comes to the UK and have a drink on it. But yeah, his parents have got a really, really unique, great story. And I think that's one that really typifies the 65th and the amazing story of how the hospitals played a part in the whole war as a total, but again, the USAAF. Quickly covering Major Robert and Enid Brown. So Robert Brown was a flying officer in the 390th over at Framlingham. He was one of the first combat crews to arrive. He became a squadron ops officer, earned a DFC, two Oak Leaf clusters, and ended his combat air operations as a major. And we're not entirely sure how these guys met, but we do have the photo that's in the picture, and the lady seated there does have an uncanny resemblance to Enid. And this is from the 390th yearbook. So it would place her at the 390th. And I do know that the 390th are talked about a lot in documentations. They come up. The 65th and the 390th were definitely two groups that worked very closely together. So it's completely feasible that they met at a dance or anything such as that. But basically, they got married here in Suffolk, and they'd stay in Air Force family. And Robert went on to fly B-52s in Vietnam. So we'll take a quick look at the patients now. So I know there's going to be one very excited lady, Katie, who joins us here tonight. This is her dad, and I'd like to introduce you to Gordon Compton. Now, Katie was the first relative of any patient or doctor or nurse, medical staff that I researched, and I absolutely thank her for giving me her dad's story to be able to tell. I know she's a big advocate of it, and she's a big supporter, and so I thank her profusely for really being the first person to really push me along this road of the 65th journey. So because of the time, I'm not going to go into too much, but basically Gordon took his P-47 up into the air on a test flight. It had some maintenance done on it, and whilst he was flying, he went to push the throttles open, which opened up the water injectors for the boost, and he had a bit of a pop. The engine sort of backfired, something similar to that. So he then called the tower, asked to do a fly past and see if there was any smoke coming from it. When he flew past, the tower confirmed negative, there was no smoke, but he decided to do a couple of circuits just to see if it could work itself out. Upon one of the circuits, he could smell gasoline in the cockpit, and it was obvious something wasn't right. So upon final approach, he then noticed that there was flames in the cockpit, and as he came down, he had a very, very heavy landing, so much so the aircraft was seen to actually bounce. The undercarriage collapsed, and he ended up on the ground. Amazingly, he managed to get out of the cockpit himself and walk away from the crash, but he was severely burned, and his head had quite a lot of injuries from being bounced around in the cockpit, despite being restrained. So he attended the 65th at Redgrave for his care, was there for a period of time. In fact, he was there right at a very strange time because his unit relocated from Metfields down to Raiden. And so he would have missed his bed being cleared up and moved for him. But when he rejoined his unit, he basically found that his injuries weren't healing quite like they should have been. And his burns basically were becoming reinfected. and his flight surgeons polled the hospital for penicillin, basically to do this, because at the time the combat operation tempo was so high, they needed every fighter pilot in the air, and Gordon was a good pilot. And basically it came push to shove, and as you can see on screen, we have a little note there which is entitled Doolittle, and it went to the highest authorities and said, you will give him penicillin, I need him back. And again, he travelled up to the 65th, was given the antibiotic, and he got back flying again just a few days before D-Day, and he took part in D-Day. So he's got a very unique story, and I know that Kate will be made up that he's been featured tonight. So yeah. We're going to go on to another quite horrific thing. Again, hopefully Marion's son Phil's watching tonight as well. So Marion was a navigator at the 490th at Eye in Suffolk, and Marion's got an interesting story, and I'm not going to draw it out too much, but basically we're not entirely sure on how the aircraft got into this situation. We know that when it came back to land, it was on fire. There was a fire in the bomb bay, and we're not entirely sure how this happened or what sort of operation was being done. I suspect it was a training mission, but a mission was mentioned, but there was nothing official listed on the day. But basically, the aircraft came to the end of the runway, or where it stopped, and everyone got out as quick as they could. Now, Marion was good at getting out of a B-17 quickly. He has a history of doing that. He bailed out over Iceland on the way over to Britain, and he survived the parachute into Iceland, while his crew managed to actually land at a local airfield. He was reunited with them and travelled over to England with them again. So he was very good at getting out of a B-17 in trouble. And we're not entirely sure what happened to him, but as you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, he was struck in the head with a propeller. And where that would be fatal for most people, Marion was very lucky. He got to the station sick quarters very quickly. They put a call into the 65th, recognising that there was not a lot that they could do for him. He needed something more substantial. And they managed to speak to William Bridges, and William Bridges turned around and said, I don't reckon he'll make it, but get him here and I'll do what I can. So when he got to Redgrave, they went to work on him, and Dr. Ivan Brown assisted in the surgery that day, and he clearly writes that the chop into the head was so deep that if it had gone another millimetre closer to the dura, which is like a membrane that goes over your brain, Marion wouldn't have been anymore. That would have been game over. And when they actually debrided the injury, cleaned it out, they actually found yellow paint actually embedded into the actual wound itself. So it's unclear how exactly he got there, but we know that he attended the 65th, and he's here, and he had multiple operations by Mr. Bridges. He put a tantalum scalp onto him and re-sewed his head, and Marion actually lived to a really ripe age, had a good life after it. So the surgeon's work was absolutely A1, and it saved his life, and he lived a good life. So from that respect, another extraordinary story of how the worlds collide like that, and how they've saved people's lives in that theatre. I'm going to quickly mention as well the 30th Bomb Group at Mendlesham, because again, there's a lot of documents that the 65th and the 34th worked very closely. They did a lot of exchange on medical side of things. Medical orderlies went over to the 34th and vice versa. And I have an awful lot of casualties from 34th. I've actually got the station sick quarters documentation from there, and it's quite extraordinary. I've got some lovely stories that just couldn't make the presentation, we'd be here all week with them. But again, they deserve a mention because they feature very, very heavily in that. And again, their Station 6 quarters is still there today. It's in industrial use. So for me, every time I drive past it, you just think, wow, I know what went on in that building. There was some extraordinary work go on in there. So again, even though it's an American hospital, there was a British connection as well. So on the morning of the 29th of November 1944, an RAF Halifax took off from Earl's Cone in Essex for a cross-country exercise to train for the upland crossing of the Rhine. Eyewitness accounts recall seeing the bomber circling the village of Stanton in trouble. Some accounts recall the starboard engine on fire and trailing smoke as it headed towards the Shepherd's Grove aerodrome. As it turned downwind for the landing, some accounts recall engines falling away from the wing as it made its final attempt to land before crashing in a ball of flames just off the Wycombe Road, south of Stanton Village. So the fuselage had disintegrated, the wings detached, and the tail and the cockpit section snapped off and away from the bomb bay section. Sergeant Forbes, the wireless operator, and Staff Sergeant Startup, the glider regiment pilot, were taken to the 65th. Unfortunately, they both passed away. And on the deaths list, you'll see just down the bottom here, what confused me for many, many years with the research on this, it's just entitled British Army. And I've got 4 names from this crash. And I'm like, well, what is a British Army officer doing in an American hospital at the centre of the USAAF? It didn't make sense. And the longer and harder you look and you research the names and things like that, I came across this. And again, for me, it's quite almost like a personal story, because again, my biological grandfather came from Shepherd's Grove in the 1950s. So, and my grandmother worked on the base. So it's close to where I grew up. And it's just another caveat to the whole story of the actual 65th.
Yeah.
And again, just for you, Paul, I thought I'd put in a slide for D-Day.
Well, you've already mentioned Ipswich. You mentioned Ipswich earlier, so that's fine. I thought you were going to say that the aircraft flew over Portman Road, and that's what guided them back. But I didn't interrupt you then. But now we've got D-Day, so you're.
Well, we never know. It could well have done so. But for D-Day, the big day came, and because it was an American hospital, it took its fair share of casualties from D-Day onwards. So the casualties just kept coming in. Because it was an army hospital and it wasn't a USAAF hospital, it served both purposes. And this is where the bulk of those 17,000 casualties came through the doors at the 65th. Just looking at the dates on screen, you can see the numbers that were coming in on the train. So if there's anyone local to the area, the trains we think were detrained at Diss, but there's a possibility they would have detrained maybe at Mellis as well. They're both close within driving distance. And again, when you think about the logistics of it, how do you get 243 casualties from a train to a hospital in the back of an ambulance? That's quite a few journeys. And again, you're talking about 7 miles. That's a lot of shuttle runs and a lot of activity. So again, it gives you an idea of what was going on, the logistics around it, the scale of what was going on as well. So technically now that is the end of the presentation, but I'd like to just leave you with a few statistics. So the 65th, applicable to the USAF, not anything else, 22 months in the UK, 17 months at Redgrave Park, and you've got 1,054 battle casualties admitted from the 8th Airforce in this period. So to put that into perspective, that's 15.5 people a week. There's 839 patients admitted for definitive care directly from their air bases on an average of 5.5 hours after being wounded. And again, that comes from the report from Dr. Gardner. These are all his figures in there as well.
Right.
So again, you're looking at a little over 12 people a week. You've got 4,000 patients admitted from 8th Airforce units, which I've classed as ground personnel because they don't particularly do it, but I suspect the way the figures are reading us at 66 bomber and fighter groups were represented. So if you put that into context, that's pretty much every group in the 8th Air Force was represented. And 13 bomber groups sent over 20 patients each. The largest for any group was 92 patients. It's not documented who that was, so I can speculate, but it's not said. There were 6 injuries caught in turrets. Would you believe it? 1 injury throwing chaff out a window, and we've already heard, 1 was struck by a propeller. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening, and that is the end of my presentation.
We're not going to let. I mean, brilliant stuff, Stuart. We're not going to let you quite off the hook yet because we've got a couple of questions, but they are, I think, fairly easy ones that won't take us down too great massive holes. Firstly, a representative comment about how people have appreciated it. Danny Boy's faves. Stuart's presentation is well researched and very knowledgeable. He has pulled it off with eloquence and consistent energy. Bravo! So there you are. So people have liked it. So the questions, right at the very beginning of this, Pete asked, were there any medical staff who were conscientious objectors? It's one of those things that always comes up when people talk about medical aspects in World War II. So there you are. Were any conscientious objectors?
I've not come across any documentation or spoken to anyone that would suggest that.
Okay, good answer. And you talked about the British aircraft there, but Ian Carr asked very early on, were there any British civilians employed in the hospitals? Because
yes,
kitchen staff, cleaners, anything like that?
Yes, there were. There were locals employed on site. In the early days, not that many. Certainly, towards the end of the war, there were more and more local people employed there. Basically, you will find as well that I have a really good story about the local vicar. Again, I spoke about this at the 65th commemorative event I held in June last year at Redgrave Church, in which I managed to get quite a lot of people, guest speakers and people to turn up, including a lot of the bomb groups. The reverend at the local church, Rickinghall, would basically cycle around the local villages collecting eggs, in which an eggnog was made to basically intravenously feed one patient that was there who was incredibly badly wounded. In fact, he was described at one point as being more dead than alive. Amazingly, he survived and had a really good life. But I think that really shows up the local feeling locally with what they would do. He would do that. And again, I know that he would spend a lot of time at the hospital talking to a lot of the patients, etc. There's not that much documentation on that, but I do definitely know there was a huge amount of local people that were employed there over time. My auntie, who now lives in Diss, she was only a young girl at the time, and she clearly remembers going up to Redgrave Park to attend the horses that my great-grandfather kept on the park, and she would have lots of conversations with the Americans through the fence kind of thing. And she recalls going up on Christmas 1944. And I've got some lovely bits from her on that. And I've spoken to several other locals as well. Dawn Rust was the daughter of one of the pub's landlords in Redgrave. And while she doesn't recall any real specifics, she really does give a flavour of how the local villages were used by not only the patients, but the 65th themselves. But it does seem as if a lot of the doctors and the nurses stayed out of the pubs. It was more the enlisted men that would frequent the local drinking establishments. The doctors and nurses, I would suggest, were probably on a much tighter schedule and kept for medical purposes.
Okay, thank you. And then the last one from the viewer, then I've got one for you as well. Magician's Apprentice asked earlier on, how were Zone 5 casualties evacuated back to the USA? Back via Iceland, Greenland, Nova Scotia by plane? So the ones that had to go back to be repatriation, how did that work?
That's a really good question. I can't give you a definitive answer on that. I know from... I'm just looking at my... I'm I know that a lot of from the documents, patients were disposed of to other evacuation hospitals or convalescence hospitals. So going on my limited knowledge of this area, because again, it's a little bit unclear, I would suggest that they went back to these convalescent hospitals, and they were if you were bad, you would probably be evacuated via ship and sail back across. But I would assume that towards the end of the war, because the flights were more capable, you would probably get some doing on that. But generally, I would say, if I was to put money on it, it would be via shipping. You would go back on one of the liners or something similar, because again, if you deteriorated, you would need somewhere that you could be worked on, etc. So I'm pretty sure that they would go back to certain evacuation or convalescent hospitals and then be disposed of through the system from there. That would I'd put money on it being that way.
Thank you. And then my last question: what is there to? I mean, you told about you hold commemorative events and reunions and things like that. What is there to see in the Redgrave Park area? Because I've got a very good mate who lives in Rickinghall, and I might be there in March. So if I was to take a little poodle around in my van, if there's anything to see, tell me about it. And if there isn't anything to see, can I meet up with you so you can show me things if there isn't anything to see, if that makes sense?
Right. Okay. Well, on that note, yes, I would like to do more at Redgrave Park. What is there to see at Redgrave Park? Well, it's a beautiful capability brown landscaped park. It's a deer park. Yeah. It's got a lovely lake in front of it, which had a prisoner of war camp in Buxton, the other side of it, during the war. There's a water tower that remains on the prison camp side of things. For the actual 65th, there is one building that remains.
Right.
And I believe it is the central power station. Now, there is a logistical problem with the park. It's actually owned by two parties that don't collaborate very well. One half gives me access to her half of the park. The other park, where the actual hospital stood, is not open for general things, but you can get relatively close and you can get a good feeling of it. I'm hoping that some of my viewers that are watching tonight were there at the event in June, because I actually took a party up and we actually did a little bit in really foul weather there. I know, again, that's something I'd like to do. I've got photographs from the area and I can actually give you a better flavour of it. The park is privately owned, so you mustn't go up in your little van without prior arrangement. But again, if anyone wants to do something like that, then I will try and arrange something. The park does open its doors for local events for the local people, so I'm sure we could arrange something like that in the future.
Brilliant. And I'll get in touch with my friend Alex, who restores World War II vehicles there, and maybe he can give you a trundle around there in one of his Humber staff cars or something like that. But Stuart, absolutely superlative presentation. Terry Down in the audience, who's Alan Converse when he appeared on World War II TV. You're not going to beat his record. Actually, you might. His show was 2 hours and 56 minutes. You're coming in at 2 hours and 53. So you're not the longest. So Alan still holds that honor. But no, absolutely amazing stuff. You're on the top of your game. You know your stuff, and there we are. And I don't think this will be the last time we invite you. I'm sure we'll have you come back and do a deeper dive into something. Well, not deeper in terms of length, but deeper in terms of one specific story. But brilliant stuff, Stuart. Again, folks, the link in the description to his Substack and to the 65th Hospital Facebook page are there. I know some of you have signed up already, so go and do that. But tomorrow, folks, we're talking about 514 Squadron Bomber Command. So we're going to the British bombing effort this tomorrow with another show. And I'll say a lot of aviation stuff coming up. Fleet Air Arm show on Friday, etc., etc. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books. Visit their websites. Read their blogs. Support their Substacks, etc., etc. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.